Hello and thank you for joining for today's dark and scary cryptid horror stories. In the comments, I would love it if you could tell us where you are listening from and maybe what cryptids pique your interest. Now for today's stories, I hope you all enjoy. Blood Moon Carnage. The Texas dawn came hot and red, a bleeding sky that foretold the violence the day would bring. Hank Morrison woke before the sun, his body conditioned by decades of ranch work to rise with the first hint of light, his joints aching in the way that told him rain was coming despite the clear sky. He pulled on his boots, worn leather molded to his feet by years of wear, and stepped out onto the porch of the ranch house he had built with his own hands 30 years ago. The smell hit him before he saw the carnage. It was wrong, coppery and thick, the scent of blood in quantities that shouldn't exist outside an abattoir. Hank had been ranching since he was 12 years old, had seen calves born breech and cows mauled by coyotes and steers trampled in stampedes, but he had never smelled anything like this. It was blood, yes, but blood without the iron tang of fresh spill. This was old blood, stagnant blood, blood that had been emptied from bodies hours ago and left to bake in the Texas heat. He grabbed the shotgun from its rack by the door, the weight of the weapon familiar and comforting, and walked toward the pasture where his herd of Angus should have been waiting for their morning feed. The gate was open, which was wrong. He never left gates open overnight, and the latch hung broken from the post, twisted metal that suggested something had torn through with tremendous force. Hank rounded the corner of the barn and stopped, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. The pasture was red, saturated with blood that had soaked into the parched earth and turned the Texas dust into crimson mud. The cattle were dead, all of them, 50 head of prime Angus lying in twisted heaps across the field. But they hadn't been slaughtered, hadn't been killed for meat or hide or even sport. They had been emptied. Each carcass was a hollow shell, skin draped over bone like a shroud, the flesh inside somehow removed without tearing the exterior. The bodies were deflated, collapsed, as if some giant hand had reached down and squeezed them like juice boxes. Their eyes were open, glazed with the shock of whatever horror had taken them in the night, and their mouths hung open in silent screams. Hank stumbled backward, his hand pressed to his mouth to keep from vomiting. He had seen death in many forms, but this was beyond death. This was erasure, consumption, a total annihilation that left nothing but containers behind. He scanned the field, looking for some sign of what had done this, some track or spoor that would tell him what he was dealing with. He found it near the center of the carnage, where the largest bull had fallen. The ground was scorched in a perfect circle around the animal, the grass blackened and the soil turned to glass as if exposed to tremendous heat. And on the bull's neck, 2 puncture wounds arranged in an inverted triangle, the skin around them blackened and necrotic. Hank knew the stories. Every rancher in South Texas knew them, the legends passed down from grandfathers and great-grandfathers, the warnings whispered around campfires and shared in bars after too many beers. El Chupacabra, the goat sucker, a creature that walked on 2 legs and drank blood, that left its victims dry as dust and marked with the sign of the devil. He had never believed it. He had seen coyotes, had seen feral dogs, had seen the damage that desperate predators could do when drought drove them to extremes. But coyotes didn't leave puncture wounds in perfect triangles. They didn't drain 50 head of cattle in a single night. They didn't scorch the earth with their passage. Hank stumbled back to the house, his shotgun forgotten in his hand, his mind reeling. He needed to call the sheriff, needed to report this, needed to do something, anything to make sense of the impossible. But even as he reached for the phone, he knew what the response would be. Coyotes, they would say, or maybe feral hogs, rational explanations for an irrational scene. No one would believe him if he told the truth. No one ever did. He made the call anyway, his voice shaking as he described what he had found. The dispatcher was professional, calm, reassuring in the way that suggested she had dealt with crazy ranchers before. Deputy Williams would be out within the hour, she promised. Try not to touch anything. Hank hung up and sat on the porch, his shotgun across his knees, waiting for the law to arrive. He didn't wait long. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when dust on the road announced the deputy's arrival, and Hank stood to greet the young man who stepped from the cruiser with the confidence of someone who had seen it all. That confidence lasted until Deputy Williams saw the pasture. "Holy Mother of God," the deputy whispered, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. "What happened here?" Hank told him haltingly, the words sticking in his throat. The deputy listened, his face carefully neutral, and when Hank finished, he simply nodded and walked into the field to examine the bodies. "Coyotes," he said when he returned, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe a pack of them. Got lucky, found a weak spot in the fence, took the herd by surprise." "Coyotes don't drain blood," Hank said quietly. "They don't leave puncture wounds. They don't burn the ground." The deputy's eyes flickered, showing something that might have been fear beneath the professional mask. "We'll have the wildlife experts take a look," he said. "Send samples to the lab, get answers." But they both knew there would be no answers, not the kind that could be written in a report and filed away. The Chupacabra didn't leave evidence that stood up to scrutiny. It left legends, nightmares, and hollow corpses that defied explanation. They buried the cattle that afternoon, a mass grave dug by the ranch hands who worked in grim silence, averting their eyes from the deflated carcasses. Hank paid them double for the work, hazard pay for dealing with something that shouldn't exist, and they took his money without speaking of what they had seen. Night fell and Hank sat on his porch with his shotgun, watching the darkness beyond the fence line. The moon was full, bloated and red, a blood moon that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent. He had heard the old stories about blood moons, about how they drew the supernatural from their hiding places, made the veil between worlds thin enough to walk through. He had never believed them, but tonight, looking at the red orb hanging in the Texas sky, he was less certain. He heard it first, a sound like nothing he had ever encountered in his decades of ranching. It was a hiss, wet and reptilian, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then a scent, sulfur and rot and something else, something ancient and hungry. Then movement at the edge of the fence, a shape that resolved from the darkness into something that walked on two legs but was not human. The Chupacabra was smaller than he had expected, perhaps 5 feet tall, but it radiated a menace that made it seem larger. Its body was hunched, covered in spines that ran down its back in a jagged ridge, and its skin was gray and scaled like a reptile's. But its eyes were the worst, glowing red in the moonlight, twin coals that burned with an intelligence that went beyond animal hunger into something deliberate, something cruel. It moved toward the fence with a gait that was somewhere between a hop and a shuffle, its clawed feet digging into the earth. Hank raised his shotgun, his hands shaking despite his years of experience with firearms. He had killed coyotes, rattlesnakes, feral hogs. He had never faced anything like this. "Get off my land," he growled, his voice steadier than he felt. The Chupacabra stopped. It cocked its head, considering him with those burning eyes, and then it did something that chilled Hank to his core. It smiled. Not a human smile, its mouth was too wide, filled with needle teeth that gleamed in the moonlight, but a smile nonetheless, a recognition of prey that thought it could fight back. It moved faster than anything had a right to move, a blur of spines and claws that covered the distance to the fence in seconds. Hank fired, the shotgun bucking against his shoulder, and he saw the buckshot hit, saw the creature's scales flare with sparks as the pellet struck. But it didn't fall, didn't even slow. The shot had done nothing, less than nothing, and the Chupacabra was over the fence and on him before he could chamber another round. The last thing Hank Morrison saw was those red eyes filling his vision, was the needle teeth descending toward his throat. He had time to scream, time to feel the puncture as the triangular wounds opened his jugular, time to feel the pressure of suction as the creature began to drink. Then the world went red, then black, then silent. The Chupacabra fed for a long time, draining the old rancher with the thoroughness of a connoisseur savoring a fine wine. When it finished, it left the body draped over the porch rail, posed like a hunting trophy, the throat slashed from ear to ear to display its handiwork. The puncture wounds were still visible, still oozing the last drops of blood that the creature hadn't managed to extract. It was a message, the Chupacabra knew, a warning to others who might think to challenge its feeding. The ranch was its territory now, the cattle its larder, the humans merely another source of sustenance. It would feed here for weeks, perhaps months, before moving on to richer hunting grounds. The drought that drove it north had been a blessing in disguise, opening new territories that the prey didn't know to fear. The creature turned toward the barn, where Hank's farmhand, a young man named Jose who had slept through the slaughter of the cattle and the death of his boss, was just now waking to the sounds of the night. The Chupacabra's eyes burned brighter, and it moved toward the barn with the silence of a predator that had perfected its craft over centuries of existence. Jose died without knowing what killed him, his throat torn open before he could scream, his blood draining into the hay that had been his bed. The Chupacabra hung his body from the rafters, a grotesque decoration that swayed in the night breeze, and moved on to the house, searching for more prey. It found nothing but empty rooms and the lingering scent of human fear. The Chupacabra hissed in frustration, its tail lashing like a whip, and turned back toward the darkness beyond the fence. Tomorrow there would be more cattle, more ranchers, more of the soft, warm prey that filled its belly and sustained its existence. Tonight it would sleep in the barn, surrounded by the trophies of its hunt, dreaming of blood. The blood moon watched it all, indifferent and ancient, its red light painting the carnage in shades of crimson and black. The legends were true, the old stories real. The Chupacabra had come to Pine Hollow Ranch, and it would not leave hungry. Dr. Lyle Carter had been laughed out of academia, his tenure revoked, his research dismissed as pseudoscience, his career reduced to a cautionary tale told in zoology departments about what happened when legitimate scientists allowed obsession to overcome reason. They had called him a disgrace, an embarrassment, a stain on the reputation of the university that had employed him for 15 years. They had destroyed his reputation, blacklisted him from publications, made him a pariah in the world of legitimate science. He didn't care, he knew he was right. The Chupacabra was real. He had evidence, grainy photographs, eyewitness testimonies, biological samples that defied conventional analysis. He had tracked the creature across Latin America, from Puerto Rico, where the first modern sightings occurred, to Mexico, where the attacks had become epidemic, through Central America and into the southern United States. He knew its habits, its habitats, its feeding patterns. He knew that the drought currently ravaging Texas had driven the creatures north in unprecedented numbers, that they were spreading like a plague through cattle country, that the authorities were covering up the truth with pathetic lies about coyotes and feral dogs. He knew, and he intended to prove it. The call had come 3 days ago, a whispered voice on his answering machine, the kind of paranoid source who refused to use email or cell phones, who trusted only landlines and face-to-face meetings. The rancher from Pine Hollow, the message had said, killed last night. Cattle slaughtered 2 nights before. The sheriff's calling it coyotes, but there's a man who saw the body, says it looks like the others, says there's no blood left, says there are puncture wounds. Carter had packed his equipment and driven through the night, his daughter Maya complaining in the passenger seat about missing school, about his obsession, about the way he had destroyed their family chasing monsters that didn't exist. She was 16, old enough to remember when he had been a respected professor, old enough to resent what he had become. "Dad, this is crazy," she said for the 100th time as they approached the turnoff to Pine Hollow Ranch. "Even if this thing is real, what do you think you're going to do? Kill it? Capture it? You're a zoologist, not a big game hunter." "I don't need to kill it," Carter replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I just need proof. A clear photograph, a tissue sample, DNA evidence that can't be explained away. That's all it would take, Maya. One piece of irrefutable evidence and the world would have to listen. And what if it kills you first? Maya asked quietly. Carter didn't answer. He couldn't answer. He had asked himself the same question 1,000 times, had lain awake nights wondering if his obsession would get him killed, if his need for validation would orphan his daughter. But the alternative, giving up, admitting defeat, letting the skeptics win, was unthinkable. He had dedicated his life to this. He couldn't stop now. They reached the ranch at noon, the Texas sun beating down mercilessly as they stepped from the car into air that smelled of dust and death. Carter could see the grave from the road, a raw scar in the earth where the cattle had been buried, and beyond it the barn where the bodies of Hank Morrison and his farmhand hung like grotesque fruit. The sheriff met them at the gate, a tired-looking man with the eyes of someone who had seen too much and understood too little. "You the professor?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "The one who thinks it's some kind of monster." "Cryptid," Carter corrected automatically. "And yes, I'm Dr. Carter. This is my daughter, Maya. Thank you for agreeing to let us examine the site." The sheriff snorted. "Didn't agree to nothing. The rancher's next of kin hired you, that's between you and them. Just don't go telling the press it was anything but coyotes. We got enough panic around here without folks thinking there's monsters in the hills." Carter nodded, though he had no intention of keeping quiet about what he found. He and Maya walked to the barn, their boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped at the entrance where the smell of decay was strongest. "Oh my God," Maya whispered, her hand covering her mouth. Carter just nodded, his professional detachment taking over despite the horror of the scene. "Notice the positioning," he said, his voice clinical. "Both bodies hung at the same height, both with the same throat wounds. This isn't random predation. This is ritual display behavior. The creature is marking its territory, warning other predators away." "Or it's just a psycho," Maya said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Look at the neck," Carter instructed, pointing with a gloved hand. "See the puncture wounds, the inverted triangle pattern. That's Chupacabra's signature. No coyote did that. No human either." Maya looked, and what she saw made her stomach turn. 2 puncture wounds on each side of the neck, arranged at angles that formed a perfect triangle with the throat at the apex. The skin around them was blackened, necrotic, as if exposed to acid or radiation. And the bodies, she had seen dead animals before, had helped her father with his research enough to develop a strong stomach. But these weren't just dead. They were emptied, deflated, the flesh somehow removed from within while leaving the skin intact. "Dad, what could do that?" she asked, her voice small. "Something that drinks blood," Carter replied. "Something with a feeding mechanism we don't understand. Something that isn't in any taxonomy book." They spent the afternoon documenting the scene, taking photographs, collecting samples from the puncture wounds and the scorched earth around the cattle grave. Carter set up his infrared cameras at strategic points around the ranch, baiting them with fresh goat meat from a local farm. The Chupacabra preferred goats, according to the legends, though it would take cattle or humans if they were available. The bait was a calculated risk. It might attract the creature, or it might simply feed it. But Carter needed footage, needed proof, and the risk was necessary. They camped in the field beyond the barn, setting up tents in the lee of a mesquite grove that offered some protection from the wind. Carter spent the evening checking his equipment, adjusting camera angles, making sure everything was ready. Maya sat by the fire, watching her father with a mixture of pity and resentment. "You really think it's going to come back?" she asked. "It will," Carter said confidently. "This is its territory now. It marked it with those bodies. It will return to feed, to check its boundaries, to hunt. We just need to be ready." "And then what?" Maya pressed. "Say you get your proof, you get your photo, your video, your whatever. What happens then?" Carter paused, considering. "Then the world knows," he said finally. "Then the authorities have to take action. Then the killing stops. Or it gets worse, Maya countered. Say people believe you, say they know these things are real. What happens then? Panic, hunting parties, everyone with a gun shooting at shadows. Dad, sometimes it's better not to know. Ignorance is never better, Carter said firmly. The truth matters, Maya. Even when it's terrifying, even when it changes everything, the truth matters. They slept in shifts, Carter taking first watch while Maya curled in her sleeping bag. The night was quiet, the only sounds the wind in the mesquite and the distant howling of coyotes. Carter watched his camera feeds, the infrared displays showing nothing but empty desert and the occasional scurrying of small mammals. It was Maya who woke him, shaking his shoulder with a hand that trembled. "Dad," she whispered, "the camera, look." Carter sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and stared at the monitor. The feed from camera 3, positioned near the cattle grave, showed movement. A shape, hunched and spined, moving with a gait that was wrong, unnatural. It approached the goat bait cautiously, sniffing the air, and turned toward the camera. Carter held his breath. The creature's eyes glowed red in the infrared twin coals that seemed to burn with their own light. It was smaller than he had expected, perhaps 5 feet tall, but the spines along its back made it seem larger, more threatening. Its skin was gray and scaled, its limbs too long for its body, its head crowned with a ridge of bone that suggested horns. The Chupacabra, real, undeniable. "Get the camera," Carter whispered, his hand reaching for his own equipment. "We need to document this. We need." The creature moved, faster than Carter had thought possible, faster than any animal had a right to move. It was on camera 3 before he could finish his sentence, its claws tearing through the plastic casing, its mouth opening to reveal needle teeth that gleamed in the infrared display. The feed cut to static. "No," Carter breathed, "no, no, no." The scream came from camera 2, then 3. The creature was moving through the ranch systematically, destroying the equipment, erasing the evidence. Carter grabbed Maya's arm, pulling her toward the truck. "We need to go. Now." But they were too slow. The Chupacabra emerged from the darkness between them and the vehicle, its red eyes fixed on Carter with an intelligence that was almost human. It hissed, a sound that vibrated in Carter's bones, made his teeth ache, made him want to drop to his knees and submit. Maya screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the paralysis, and Carter found the strength to move. He pushed his daughter toward the barn, the only shelter available, and followed on her heels. The creature lunged, its claws raking his back, tearing through his jacket and the flesh beneath. He felt the pain, hot and wet, but adrenaline drove him forward, into the barn, slamming the door behind them. The Chupacabra hit the door with a sound like a sledgehammer striking wood. The boards bowed, splintered, but held. For now. "The loft," Carter gasped, blood running down his back. "Climb." They scrambled up the ladder, Maya first, Carter following as fast as his wounded body would allow. The creature hit the door again, and this time it gave, the wood shattering under the impact. The Chupacabra entered the barn, its head swiveling, searching, and Carter saw it clearly for the first time in the dim light filtering through the loft window. It was nightmare-made flesh. Its body was covered in scales that shifted color as it moved, gray to brown to black, camouflage that made it hard to track. The spines along its back were not just decoration, they were weapons, sharp enough to pierce skin, flexible enough to be used in combat. Its tail was long and muscular, tipped with a blade of bone that could slice through meat with ease. But its eyes were the worst. They glowed red, yes, but they were also ancient, intelligent, aware. This was not a dumb animal. This was a predator that understood tactics, strategy, patience. It had been hunting humans for centuries, had learned their habits, their weaknesses, their patterns. It knew that Carter and Maya were trapped, knew that they had nowhere to go. It began to climb the ladder, its claws finding purchase on the wood with ease. Carter looked around desperately, searching for a weapon, something to fight with. His eyes fell on Hank Morrison's body, still hanging from the rafter, and the shotgun that had fallen from the rancher's hand when he died. The gun was broken, the stock cracked where the Chupacabra had thrown it aside after killing its owner. But there were shells in the bandolier, and Carter had enough knowledge of firearms to know that even a damaged shotgun could fire if the chamber was intact. He grabbed the weapon, ignoring the blood that still oozed from his back, and aimed at the creature as it crested the ladder. "Get back," he snarled, though the words felt hollow. The Chupacabra didn't understand English, didn't care about threats. It leaped. Carter fired. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space of the barn. The buckshot hit the Chupacabra center mass, the impact knocking it back toward the ladder. But it didn't fall. The pellets had done nothing, less than nothing, sparking off the creature's scales without leaving so much as a scratch. The Chupacabra hissed, louder this time, and Carter felt something else in that sound. Not just warning, not just threat. Pain. The creature was angry now, wounded in its pride if not its body, and it would not be merciful. It lunged again, and Carter raised the shotgun like a club, swinging with desperate strength. The wooden stock connected with the creature's head, a solid blow that would have stunned a man, but the Chupacabra barely flinched. Its claws raked Carter's arm, opening gashes that bled freely, and its mouth opened wide, the needle teeth descending toward his throat. Maya screamed again, and the sound distracted the creature. It turned toward her, its red eyes calculating, deciding which prey to take first. Carter used the moment to swing again, hitting the creature's shoulder, then its back, then its head. The blows had no effect, but they bought seconds, precious seconds. "The window," he gasped at Maya. "Jump." She didn't hesitate. She ran to the loft window and threw herself through it, the glass shattering around her as she fell to the ground below. Carter heard her hit, heard her cry of pain, then silence. He prayed she was alive, prayed she had survived, even as the Chupacabra turned back to him, its patience exhausted. "This is it," he thought. "This is how it ends. Chased out of academia, laughed out of science, killed by the very monster I tried to prove existed. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so final." But the killing blow didn't come. The creature paused, its head cocking, listening to something that Carter couldn't hear. Then it turned, leaped from the loft, and vanished into the night without a backward glance. Carter collapsed, his body giving out from blood loss and terror. He lay there for hours, drifting in and out of consciousness, until dawn brought the sheriff and a search party that had been looking for them. They found him in the barn, surrounded by the bodies of the dead, barely alive, raving about monsters and red eyes and things that shouldn't exist. They found Maya outside, unconscious but alive, a sprained ankle and a concussion the worst of her injuries. She had crawled 50 yards from the barn before passing out, had hidden in a drainage ditch where the Chupacabra hadn't found her, or had chosen not to find her. The authorities called it a bear attack, or maybe a mountain lion, or possibly a rabid dog. The wounds were consistent with animal attack, they said, though they couldn't explain the puncture wounds or the blood loss. The scorch marks were from a lightning strike or a brush fire or some other natural phenomenon. The destruction of the cameras was vandalism, local kids causing trouble. The rancher's death was a tragedy, but a natural one, not the work of monsters. Carter let them believe it. He was done trying to convince the world. He had seen the Chupacabra, had faced it, had survived by luck alone. That was enough. That was proof for him if for no one else. But as he lay in the hospital bed, his wounds bandaged and his mind clear for the first time in days, he realized something. The creature had let them live. It could have killed them both easily, but it had stopped. It had heard something or sensed something that had made it retreat. What could make a Chupacabra run? The answer came 3 days later in the form of a news report from Louisiana. A Cajun trapper had gone missing in the bayou. The only evidence was his skiff, found abandoned in the swamp, its hull gouged by claws too large for any gator. The locals were whispering about the Rougarou, the Cajun werewolf, the creature that hunted during Lent when Catholics denied it fresh sinners. Carter smiled despite his pain. The Chupacabra hadn't run from nothing. It had run from something worse. And if he was right, if his years of research had taught him anything, those two creatures were on a collision course. Drought had driven the Chupacabra north. Starvation had driven the Rougarou west. They would meet, sooner or later, in the no-man's land between their territories. And when they did, Carter intended to be there to watch. The cryptids were real, the legends were true, and the world was about to find out just how terrifying that truth could be. Baptiste Leblanc had been trapping the Atchafalaya Basin since he was 12 years old, when his father had first taken him out in a pirogue to check the lines they had set the night before. 40 years later, he knew every bayou and backwater, every cypress knee and submerged log, every gator hole and gar run in the 300 square miles of swamp that he called home. He had survived hurricanes and floods, had fought off cottonmouths and gators, had once killed a feral hog with nothing but a skinning knife when it charged him in the marsh. He was a man who knew the swamp, who respected it, who understood that nature was neither cruel nor kind, but simply indifferent to human concerns. But he had never seen anything like what he found that morning in March. The skiff had been Jean Pierre's, his cousin's, a battered aluminum boat that had been patched so many times it was more weld than metal. Baptiste had recognized it immediately, had known something was wrong before he even reached the vessel. The boat was floating in the center of a bayou that should have been too shallow for it, drifting in circles like a leaf on a pond, and there was no sign of Jean Pierre anywhere. Baptiste guided his own pirogue alongside the skiff, his pole probing the muddy bottom for purchase. The smell hit him first, sulfur and rot, the stench of the swamp at its most decayed, but concentrated, intensified, as if something had died here recently and violently. He peered into the boat, searching for blood or signs of struggle, and found the marks. Claw marks, deep gouges in the aluminum, 5 parallel lines that ran from the bow to the stern, deep enough to dent the metal, strong enough to tear through the patches that had held the boat together for decades. They were too large for a gator. Even the biggest bulls in the basin didn't have claws that size. Too organized for an animal, too purposeful. These were the marks of something that had reached into the boat and tried to drag out whatever was inside. Baptiste felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He knew the stories, had heard them since childhood, the legends his grandmother had whispered about the thing that walked in the swamp during Lent. The Rougarou, the loup-garou, the Cajun werewolf. He had never believed it. He had seen gators that were almost prehistoric in size, had encountered nutria that grew big as dogs in the fertile marshlands, had heard his share of stories about swamp creatures that turned out to be nothing more than exaggerated sightings of known animals. The Rougarou was a legend, a bedtime story to keep children from wandering into the swamp at night, a cautionary tale about the dangers of breaking Lent or disrespecting the faith. But looking at those claw marks, smelling that sulfur stench, Baptiste felt his certainty waver. He searched the area for hours, calling Jean Pierre's name, hoping against hope that his cousin had escaped, had swum to shore, was waiting somewhere in the cypress groves for rescue. But the swamp was silent, the only sounds the drip of water from Spanish moss and the distant call of herons hunting the shallows. Jean Pierre was gone, and Baptiste knew with the certainty of a man who had seen too much death that his cousin would not be coming back. He returned to his camp, a shack on stilts that had been his grandfather's before him, and made the call to the sheriff. They would search, he knew, would drag the bayou and comb the banks and eventually declare Jean Pierre lost to the swamp. It happened all the time, people disappearing in the basin, claimed by gators or currents, or simply the vastness of a wilderness that swallowed the unwary without remorse. But Baptiste knew. The marks on the skiff were not gator marks. The sulfur smell was not swamp gas. Something else was hunting in the basin, something ancient and hungry that had been driven from its normal haunts by circumstances Baptiste didn't understand. He spent the evening preparing his camp, boarding windows and reinforcing doors, filling every container he had with holy water from the bottle his grandmother had given him before she died. He didn't know if it would help against a Rougarou. The legend said the creature was Catholic, that it feared crosses and holy water and the prayers of the faithful, but he wasn't willing to take chances. If the thing came for him, he would be ready. Night fell and the swamp changed. The sounds that had been comforting during the day, the frogs and insects, the fish breaking the surface, the gentle lap of water against the pilings, became ominous, threatening. Baptiste sat in his shack with his shotgun across his knees and his grandmother's rosary wrapped around his hand, listening to the darkness beyond the walls. It came at midnight. He heard it first, a howl that was wrong, that started as a wolf's cry but ended as something human, something that spoke of agony and rage and an endless hunger. The sound echoed across the bayou, making the frogs fall silent, making the insects stop their chirping, making the very air seem to hold its breath in anticipation. Then he smelled it, sulfur and wet fur, the musk of predator and the rot of the grave. It was close, closer than the howl had suggested, already at the foot of his stilts. Baptiste raised his shotgun, his hands shaking despite his years of experience. The boards beneath him creaked as something heavy climbed the stairs, something that moved with a deliberation that suggested intelligence, planning. The Rougarou, if it was the Rougarou, didn't attack like an animal. It stalked, it hunted, it played with its prey. The door exploded inward, splinters flying like shrapnel. Baptiste fired without thinking, the shotgun blast catching the creature in the shoulder, knocking it back. But it didn't fall. It stood in the doorway, filling the frame with its bulk, and Baptiste saw it clearly for the first time. The Rougarou was a nightmare of hybrid anatomy, somewhere between wolf and man but belonging fully to neither. It stood 7 feet tall, hunched slightly to fit through the door, its body covered in matted fur that shifted between brown and gray in the dim light. Its arms were too long, ending in hands that were more paw than human but still capable of grasping, of manipulating, of tearing. Its legs were bent backward like a dog's, powerful muscles bunching beneath the fur as it prepared to spring. But its face was the worst. It was wolf-like, yes, with an elongated muzzle filled with teeth that gleamed yellow in the moonlight streaming through the broken door. But the eyes were human, pale blue and filled with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. This was not a dumb beast. This was a man transformed, cursed, trapped in a body that hungered for flesh it couldn't control. "Sacre Dieu," Baptiste whispered, crossing himself with a hand that trembled. The Rougarou snarled, a sound that was more growl than speech but carried meaning nonetheless. It was hungry, Baptiste realized. Starving. The legend said the creature fed on sinners during Lent, on those who broke their fasts or committed mortal crimes. But this year was different. This year the faithful had stayed faithful, the sinners had stayed away from the swamp, and the Rougarou had been denied its feast. It had been driven to desperation, to hunting outside its normal territory, to taking victims like Jean-Pierre who had done nothing to deserve their fate. And now it was here, in Baptiste's shack, looking at him with eyes that held both hunger and regret. Baptiste fired again, the second barrel of the shotgun catching the creature in the chest. The impact knocked it backward, off the porch and into the water below. Baptiste didn't wait to see if it was dead. He grabbed his gear, his holy water, his grandmother's rosary, and climbed out the window, dropping the 12 feet to the ground with a grunt of pain as his knees buckled. He ran, not toward his pirogue but away from it, into the swamp, into the maze of cypress and tupelo where no creature, not even a Rougarou, could track him easily. Behind him, he heard the splash of the creature emerging from the water, heard the howl of rage that followed him into the darkness. He ran for hours, wading through water that reached his waist, climbing over fallen logs, pushing through sawgrass that cut his skin like razor blades. The moon was high, nearly full, casting silver light through the cypress canopy that turned the swamp into a landscape of shadows and reflections. Every splash was the Rougarou, every rustle of branches its pursuit. Baptiste's lungs burned, his legs ached, but he kept moving, kept running because stopping meant dying. Dawn found him collapsed on a mud flat, miles from his camp, his body trembling with exhaustion and cold. The Rougarou had not followed, had given up the chase sometime in the night, or perhaps had found easier prey. Baptiste didn't know, didn't care. He was alive, and that was enough. But as he lay there, watching the sun rise over the swamp, he realized something. The creature was moving. The drought that gripped Texas had driven animals north, had disrupted the normal patterns of predator and prey. The Rougarou, starving and desperate, would follow the food, would leave the bayou and hunt in territory it had never before claimed. And somewhere in that northern territory, something else was hunting. Something that had been seen in Texas, something that drank blood and left its victims dry. Baptiste had heard the stories on the radio, the reports of cattle mutilations and strange deaths, the rumors that the authorities were trying to cover up. Two monsters, one territory, one prey. They would meet, Baptiste knew, and when they did, the bloodshed would be unlike anything the world had seen. The drought had been going on for 3 years, the worst in recorded history, turning the Southwest into a dust bowl that rivaled the disasters of the 1930s. Cattle died by the thousands, their bodies bloating in the sun, their bones whitening the landscape. Ranchers went bankrupt, sold their land, moved east in search of greener pastures. The wilderness that remained became a pressure cooker, predators competing for prey that grew scarcer by the day. The Chupacabra had thrived at first. The cattle were weak, easy targets, and the drought drove the creatures north in search of new hunting grounds. But as the drought continued, even the Chupacabra felt the pinch. Competition increased, not just from other Chupacabra but from displaced predators of every kind: coyotes, mountain lions, feral dogs, all driven to desperation by the lack of prey. And then there were the wolves. Not the gray wolves of the north, but Mexican wolves, red wolves, hybrid populations that had been pushed out of their territories by human expansion and climate change. They were desperate, starving, willing to take risks that normal wolves would avoid. They had learned to hunt in daylight, to approach human settlements, to take livestock and pets, and in some cases people. The Rougarou, for all its supernatural origins, was still a predator, still subject to the laws of nature that governed all living things. Starvation drove it west out of the bayou and into the scrublands of East Texas, following the scent of prey that grew stronger with every mile. It avoided the cities, the towns, the places where humans gathered in numbers. But it found the ranches, the isolated farms, the small communities where people still lived close to the land. It fed when it could, taking cattle mostly, occasionally a dog or a horse. But the hunger was constant, gnawing a fire in its belly that could only be quenched by the hot rush of blood and the soft flesh of living prey. It remembered being human, remembered the rules that had governed its former existence, but those memories grew dimmer with each passing day. Soon, it knew, it would lose itself entirely, would become nothing but the hunger, the beast, the monster that hunted and killed without thought or remorse. The slaughterhouse outside San Antonio had been abandoned for decades, a relic of the meatpacking industry that had once thrived in the region. The building sat on 50 acres of scrubland, its corrugated metal walls rusted orange, its concrete floors stained with blood that no amount of scrubbing could remove. It was a place of death, of slaughter, and it drew predators like a magnet. The Chupacabra found it first, drawn by the scent of old blood and the promise of shelter. The building was cavernous, its interior dark and cool, perfect for a creature that shunned the daylight. It made a den in the killing floor, among the rusted hooks and chains that had once held cattle for the knife, and it waited. It didn't have to wait long. The cattle in the surrounding pastures were weak, easy targets, and the Chupacabra fed well for 3 days, draining them dry and dragging the bodies back to its lair. But on the 4th day, it sensed something else in the area, something that made its spines rise and its tail lash in warning. Another predator, a competitor. The Rougarou had followed the scent of blood from 5 miles away. its nose leading it unerringly to the slaughterhouse. It approached cautiously, knowing that any predator that could kill so many cattle in so short a time was dangerous, but driven by hunger that overrode caution. It needed to feed, and soon, or it would lose the last shreds of its humanity entirely. The two creatures met in the killing floor, the Chupacabra perched on a rusted catwalk above, the Rougarou standing in the doorway with the moonlight at its back. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, sizing up the competition, calculating the odds. Both were predators. Both were hungry. Both were apex predators in their own territories, unaccustomed to sharing. The Chupacabra hissed first, a sound that filled the slaughterhouse and vibrated the rusted metal. It was a challenge, a declaration of ownership. This was its territory, its kill, its feeding ground. The interloper would leave or die. The Rougarou responded with a howl that started as a cry and ended as a roar, a sound that spoke of curses and hunger and the endless rage of a man trapped in a beast's body. It was a rejection, a refusal to submit. The territory was unclaimed, the prey unowned. The stronger would feed. They circled each other, the Chupacabra dropping from the catwalk to land in a crouch, the Rougarou pacing on all fours like the wolf it resembled. Both knew this would end in death. Predators didn't share territory, didn't coexist in the same hunting grounds. One would kill, one would die, and the survivor would claim all the prey in the region. The Chupacabra struck first, a blur of spines and claws that covered the distance between them in seconds. The Rougarou met the charge with its own speed, the two creatures colliding in the center of the killing floor with a sound like thunder. Phase 1 began with the impact, the sound of scale against fur, claw against claw, teeth snapping at throats that were protected by spines and muscle. The Chupacabra's claws raked the Rougarou's chest, leaving trails of black blood that smelled of sulfur and rot. The Rougarou's jaws closed on the Chupacabra's shoulder, teeth sinking through scales into the flesh beneath. The Chupacabra screeched, a sound that shattered windows and set off car alarms half a mile away. It twisted in the Rougarou's grip, its spines flaring, driving into the werewolf's muzzle and face. The Rougarou released its hold, roaring in pain as the spines pierced its eyes, blinding it temporarily. They separated, circling again, both wounded now, both more cautious. The Chupacabra's shoulder bled greenish ichor that sizzled when it hit the concrete, burning small holes in the floor. The Rougarou's face was a mask of blood, one eye torn, the other swelling shut, but its remaining eye burned with a fury that transcended pain. "You burn," the Rougarou growled, and the Chupacabra hesitated. It had not expected speech, had not thought its opponent capable of human language. But the Rougarou was not fully beast, not yet, and it could still form words when the rage allowed. "Your blood burns." The Chupacabra hissed in response, not understanding the words but recognizing the challenge. It lunged again, lower this time, going for the Rougarou's legs, trying to disable the creature before it could recover from its wounds. But the Rougarou was ready. It sprang aside, using its powerful hind legs to launch itself onto a conveyor belt that had once carried carcasses to the processing room. From there, it leaped to a catwalk, gaining the high ground, forcing the Chupacabra to climb if it wanted to continue the fight. The Chupacabra didn't climb. It jumped, its powerful legs propelling it 20 feet into the air to land on the catwalk beside the Rougarou. The metal groaned under their combined weight, rusted bolts snapping, the structure swaying precariously. The Rougarou struck first this time, a swipe of its claws that caught the Chupacabra across the face, tearing through the scales and exposing the muscle beneath. The Chupacabra reeled back, itching in pain, and the Rougarou pressed its advantage, driving forward with a series of blows that forced the blood drinker toward the edge of the catwalk. Phase 2 began when the Chupacabra's eyes began to pulse, the red glow intensifying until they seemed to burn with their own light. It was a signal, a warning, and the Rougarou recognized it even if it didn't understand it. The creature was preparing something some attack that went beyond tooth and claw. The sound came a moment later, a vibration that started in the infrasonic range, below the threshold of human hearing, but rising rapidly into something that could be felt in the bones. It was the Chupacabra's hunting cry, amplified to weapon proportions, a sonic attack that targeted the inner ear and the balance centers of the brain. The Rougarou staggered, its remaining eye widening in pain and confusion. The sound was inside its head, vibrating its skull, making its vision blur and its stomach heave. It tried to attack, to close the distance and silence the source of the noise, but its coordination was gone, its movements jerky and uncontrolled. The Chupacabra pressed forward, still emitting the scream, driving the Rougarou back toward the edge of the catwalk. One more step, one more push, and the werewolf would fall, would crash to the killing floor below, would be broken and easy prey. But the Rougarou had not survived centuries of cursed existence by being easy prey. As the Chupacabra closed for the kill, the werewolf did something unexpected. It stopped fighting the sound and embraced it, letting the vibration fill its body, its mind, its soul. The rage that had been building since the curse first took hold, the rage that had driven it to kill and hunt and consume, broke free of all restraint. Berserk. The word came from somewhere in the Rougarou's fading human memories, from stories of warriors who fought without fear or pain, who killed until they were killed. That was what it became now, a creature of pure rage, all strategy abandoned, all caution forgotten. It charged. The impact knocked the Chupacabra off the catwalk, both creatures tumbling through the air to crash onto the killing floor below. The Chupacabra landed on its feet, cat-like, but the Rougarou landed on top of it, driving it into the concrete with the full weight of its 7-foot frame. Teeth closed on the Chupacabra's throat, biting through scales, through muscle, through the tough cartilage that protected the blood drinker's jugular. The Chupacabra thrashed, its claws raking the Rougarou's back, its tail whipping around to strike at the werewolf's head. But the Rougarou's rage had made it oblivious to pain. It held on, biting deeper, shaking its head like a dog with a rat, trying to tear out the Chupacabra's throat. Green blood sprayed, the acidic ichor burning the Rougarou's muzzle, its face, its one remaining eye. It didn't release. It bit harder, feeling the cartilage give way, feeling the Chupacabra's struggles weaken. Then the tail struck home. The bony blade at the tip of the Chupacabra's tail, sharp as a scalpel, drove into the Rougarou's side, seeking the soft flesh beneath the ribs. It found the gap between bones and plunged deep, piercing the werewolf's liver, slicing through the organ like wet paper. The Rougarou screamed, a sound that was all human, all agony, and released its hold on the Chupacabra's throat. It staggered back, the tail blade still embedded in its side, black blood pouring from the wound in quantities that spoke of a mortal injury. The Chupacabra rose, its throat a ruin of torn flesh and green ichor, but its eyes still burning with the will to survive. It watched the Rougarou stumble, watched the light fade from that one remaining eye, and knew it had won. The werewolf would bleed out in minutes, would die here on the killing floor, and the Chupacabra would feed on its corpse before resuming its hunt. But the Rougarou wasn't done. Even as its life flowed out onto the concrete, it reached up and grabbed the Chupacabra's tail, pulling the creature closer, using the last of its strength to drag its enemy within reach of its claws. Together, it growled, and then its claws struck, raking down the Chupacabra's belly, opening it from sternum to groin. Green entrails spilled onto the killing floor, acidic and steaming. The Chupacabra screamed, tried to pull away, but the Rougarou held on, its claws buried in the creature's gut, its teeth finding the exposed spine and closing with a snap. They fell together, locked in a death embrace, each killing the other even as they died. The Rougarou's jaws crushed the Chupacabra's spinal cord, paralyzing it from the waist down. The Chupacabra's claws, in one last spasm, found the Rougarou's throat and tore it out, ending the curse and the creature that bore it. They lay together on the killing floor, blood mixing, black and green, werewolf and cryptid, forming a puddle that spread across the concrete and dripped through the cracks in the floor to the earth below. The moon watched through broken windows, indifferent to the death of monsters. Phase 3 was over. Maya Carter had followed the fight from a distance, crouched in the bushes outside the slaughterhouse, her father's infrared camera trained on the building's interior through a broken window. She had seen everything, recorded everything, the evidence that would prove her father right, that would vindicate his years of obsession. She had also seen both creatures die, seen them kill each other in an orgy of violence that made her want to vomit. The sounds had been the worst, the hissing and howling, the wet tearing of flesh, the final screams that had been all too human. She had heard the Rougarou speak, had heard it call the Chupacabra's blood burning, had heard it say together as it committed suicide by murder. Now the slaughterhouse was silent, and Maya knew she needed to move. The creatures were dead, but that didn't mean the danger was over. The authorities would find the bodies, would investigate, would want to know what had happened. And Maya had evidence that could change the world, proof that monsters were real, that the legends were true. She crept toward the building, camera held ready, her heart pounding so loud she was sure it could be heard across the compound. The door was open, torn from its hinges by the Rougarou's entry, and she slipped inside, moving from shadow to shadow, trying to be silent. The smell hit her first, a combination of sulfur and rot and blood, so much blood that made her gag. Then she saw them, the two bodies lying in the center of the killing floor, tangled together in death. The Chupacabra looked smaller in death, its scales already losing their luster, its spines drooping like wilted flowers. The wound in its belly gaped open, green intestines spilling onto the floor, and its throat was a ruin of torn flesh. But its eyes were still open, still glowing faintly red, as if even death couldn't fully extinguish the creature's unnatural life. The Rougarou was worse. In death the curse was breaking, the wolf-like features melting away to reveal the human beneath. It was a man, Maya realized, a young man with dark hair and pale skin, his face twisted in an expression of agony and relief. The wounds were horrific, his throat torn out, his belly sliced open, his side pierced by the Chupacabra's tail blade. But it was the human face that disturbed her most, the recognition that this had been a person, cursed and twisted but still a person. She filmed it all, documented everything, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the camera steady. Then she approached the bodies, risking a closer look, wanting to touch, to confirm that this was real and not some hallucination. The Chupacabra's flesh was cold and scaly, like touching a snake or a lizard. The Rougarou's was warm, still warm, the heat of life not yet fully departed. Maya jerked her hand back, suddenly terrified, and that's when she saw it. Movement, not from the Rougarou whose chest was still, whose heart had stopped, from the Chupacabra. Its wounds were healing, not healing in the way that living things healed, slowly and with scarring. Healing in the way that was impossible, that defied biology and physics and everything Maya understood about the world. The torn flesh of its throat was knitting together, the green ichor flowing backward into the wound, the scales reforming over the injury. Its belly was closing, the entrails retracting, the skin sealing over the hole that the Rougarou had torn. And it was twitching, small movements at first, then larger ones. Its tail, still buried in the Rougarou's side, began to withdraw, sliding free of the dead flesh with a wet sound that made Maya's stomach churn. She ran. She didn't think, didn't hesitate, just turned and sprinted for the door, for the night, for the safety of distance. Behind her she heard a hiss, low and satisfied, the sound of a creature waking from sleep. Then footsteps, the clicking of claws on concrete, the sound of pursuit. She didn't look back. She ran through the scrubland, through cactus and mesquite, her legs burning, her lungs screaming. She ran until she found the road, until she found her car, until she was driving away with the pedal to the floor and the Chupacabra's red eyes burning in her rearview mirror. It let her go. She didn't know why, didn't understand why the creature would spare her when it had killed so many others. But it stood at the edge of the slaughterhouse property, watching her leave, and then it turned and walked back into the darkness, its wounds almost healed, its hunger undiminished. Maya drove until she reached the nearest town, until she found a motel and locked herself in the bathroom and finally let herself scream. She screamed until her throat was raw, until her voice gave out, until she collapsed against the bathtub and sobbed like a child. The Chupacabra was alive, or had never died, or had come back from death, which was worse. The Rougarou was dead, but the Chupacabra remained, and it was healing, recovering, preparing to hunt again. She thought of her father, of his obsession, of his need to prove the existence of these creatures. He had been right, but being right didn't matter if you were dead. The Chupacabra would kill him if it found him, would kill her, would kill anyone who got in its way. Unless they stopped it, unless they found a way to kill it for good, to destroy it completely, to end its reign of terror. Maya looked at the camera in her hands, the evidence it contained, the proof that the world was not what it seemed. She had a choice. She could destroy the footage, go home, pretend none of this had happened, live a normal life in a normal world where monsters didn't exist. Or she could finish what her father started. She could find a way to kill the Chupacabra, to track it to its lair, to end the threat it posed to everyone she loved. She made her decision. The Chupacabra fed that night, taking a stray dog from the outskirts of the town, draining it dry in seconds. It felt stronger now, the battle with the Rougarou having triggered something in its metabolism, some adaptation that made it faster, tougher, more resilient. It was evolving, changing, becoming something even more dangerous than before. And it wasn't alone. In the shadows, watching from the rooftops, other eyes glowed red. Other Chupacabra, drawn by the battle, by the scent of blood, by the call of their kind. They were breeding, multiplying, spreading across the drought-ravaged landscape like a plague. The Rougarou was dead, but the war was just beginning. Maya Carter, hiding in her motel room, didn't know about the others. She thought she faced one monster, one creature that could be hunted and killed. She didn't know that the Chupacabra was a species, a population, an army of blood drinkers that had been waiting for just the right conditions to emerge from hiding. She would learn. They all would. The world was about to discover that the legends were true, that the monsters were real, and that the age of human dominance was coming to an end. The blood moon rose again, red and bloated, and beneath it the Chupacabra hunted, fed, multiplied. The drought continued, the prey grew scarce, and the predators grew bolder. The war between species had begun, and humanity was losing. 6 months later, the drought had spread to India. Cattle died in the streets of Mumbai, their bodies drained of blood, marked with puncture wounds in perfect inverted triangles. The government called it a new disease, a virus, a biological weapon. The people knew better. Scientist Dejo Thomas had been called in to examine one of the carcasses, a water buffalo that had been found in a rice paddy outside Hyderabad. He was a skeptic, a rationalist, a man who believed in science and reason and the power of human knowledge to explain the world. He didn't believe in monsters. But looking at the puncture wounds, smelling the sulfur, seeing the way the blood had been removed without spilling a drop, he felt his certainty waver. "Camera," he said to his assistant, his voice tight, "I need to document this." The assistant raised the camera, panning across the carcass, capturing the wounds, the scorched earth, the signs of a predator that shouldn't exist. Then the camera panned to the jungle at the edge of the paddy, to the darkness beneath the trees. There were eyes in the jungle, red eyes glowing in the shadows, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, staring at the humans with an intelligence that was ancient and hungry and patient. Dejo Thomas didn't run. He couldn't run, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare into those eyes and understand that the world had changed, that the rules he had lived by no longer applied, that the monsters had won. The camera continued to record as the Chupacabra emerged from the jungle, as the creatures moved in unison toward the humans, as the screaming began. The last image the camera captured was the face of the Chupacabra, its scales gleaming in the moonlight, its mouth opening to reveal needle teeth that descended toward the lens. Then the feed cut to black. In Texas, Maya Carter saw the footage on the dark web, posted by someone who had found the camera in the jungle, who had seen the truth and wanted the world to know. She watched it once, twice, 3 times, and each time she felt her resolve harden. There was more than one. There had always been more than one. The creature she had faced at the slaughterhouse was not unique, not special, not the last of its kind. It was one of many, an army of blood drinkers spreading across the world, and no one was prepared to stop them. But Maya was preparing. She had spent the last 6 months training, learning to fight, studying everything she could find about the Chupacabra and its weaknesses. She had a team now, other survivors, other believers, other people who had seen the truth and refused to look away. They would find the creatures. They would hunt them. They would end the threat, one Chupacabra at a time, until the world was safe again. Or they would die trying. In the jungle, the Chupacabra fed on Dejo Thomas and his team, draining them dry and leaving their bodies as warnings to others who might think to challenge their dominance. Then they retreated into the darkness, full and satisfied, to sleep and digest and wait for the next feeding. The Rougarou was dead, its curse ended, its line extinguished. But the Chupacabra lived on, multiplied, spread. The war continued and the outcome was uncertain. But Maya Carter was coming, and she brought with her the wrath of humanity, the power of knowledge, and the determination to win. The final battle had not yet begun, but it was coming. And when it arrived, the blood would flow like rivers. Maya Carter stood in her father's study, surrounded by the detritus of his obsession. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, evidence of 3 decades spent chasing shadows. Cryptid sightings circled in red ink, witness testimonies transcribed in her father's precise handwriting, biological samples stored in jars that lined shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. It was a monument to madness, or to genius, depending on your perspective. She ran her fingers over the journals, the notebooks, the thousands of pages of research that had consumed her father's life and ultimately ended it. Dr. Lyle Carter had died 3 months after the slaughterhouse incident, not from the wounds the Chupacabra had inflicted, but from an infection that resisted every antibiotic the doctors tried. The creature's blood had been toxic, they discovered, carrying bacteria that no human immune system could fight. He had died screaming, his body consumed by fever, his mind consumed by visions of red eyes and needle teeth. Maya had held his hand at the end, had listened to his final words, had promised him that she would finish what he started. "Find them," he had whispered, his voice barely audible over the rattle of his failing breath. "All of them, kill them, don't let them win." She had promised, and now, 6 months later, she was ready to keep that promise. The team she had assembled was small but dedicated. Baptiste LeBlanc, the Cajun trapper who had survived his own encounter with the Rougarou, had joined her after the creature's death in San Antonio. He brought knowledge of tracking, of hunting, of the old ways that modern science had forgotten. His hands were scarred from the Chupacabra's claws, his back bore the marks of the creature's attack, but his spirit was unbroken. Sarah Chen was a veterinarian who had seen the aftermath of a Chupacabra attack on a horse farm in Arizona. She had tried to save the animals, had witnessed the puncture wounds, the bloodless bodies, the signs that no natural predator could have left. She had been dismissed as hysterical, accused of fabricating evidence, threatened with the loss of her license. She had joined Maya seeking vindication and revenge. Marcus Webb was ex-military, special forces, dishonorably discharged after a mission in the Middle East went wrong. He didn't talk about what had happened, but Maya could see the ghosts in his eyes, the same ghosts that haunted her own sleepless nights. He was their tactical expert, their weapons specialist, their protection against the creatures that hunted them. 4 people against an army. They had spent the last 6 months training, preparing, studying every piece of evidence they could find. Maya had pored over her father's research, cross-referencing sightings, mapping migration patterns, trying to understand the Chupacabra's behavior. What she found disturbed her. The creatures weren't just predators. They were organized. They communicated, coordinated, established territories and hierarchies. The slaughterhouse had been a meeting ground, a place where multiple Chupacabra had gathered, drawn by the scent of blood and the promise of easy prey. The creature she had seen heal itself was not unique. They all possessed that regenerative ability, that capacity to recover from wounds that would kill any natural creature. They were breeding. The population was growing, expanding, colonizing new territories as the drought drove them north, and the food shortage forced them to compete with human populations. Within a year, perhaps 2, they would be too numerous to stop. Within 5, humanity would be reduced to livestock, prey for creatures that had waited centuries for the right conditions to emerge. Maya couldn't let that happen. "The thermal imaging is ready," Marcus said, entering the study without knocking. He was a big man, 6'4" and 240 pounds of muscle, but he moved with the quiet grace of someone trained to be invisible. "We picked up signatures near the old Morrison Ranch, multiple heat sources, clustered together." "How many?" Maya asked, her hand tightening on her father's journal. "At least 6, maybe more. They're nesting in the barn, using it as a den." Maya nodded, setting the journal aside. "Then that's where we start. We hit them at dawn while they're sleeping. We burn the barn, kill anything that tries to escape." "That's a lot of firepower," Baptiste observed from the doorway, his weathered face unreadable. "You sure you're ready for this? Once we start, there's no going back." "I'm sure," Maya said, and she almost believed it. They moved at 400 when the world was still dark and the creatures would be at their most vulnerable. The Morrison Ranch had been abandoned since the deaths of Hank and Jose, the land reverting to the state for unpaid taxes. It was perfect Chupacabra territory now, isolated, defensible, surrounded by cattle ranches that provided easy prey. Marcus led the team, moving through the scrubland with the silence of a ghost. Maya followed, her heart hammering against her ribs, her father's shotgun heavy in her hands. Sarah and Baptiste brought up the rear, armed with incendiary weapons, the only thing that seemed to hurt the creatures, according to her father's research. They found the barn surrounded by bones. Cattle mostly, but Maya saw other shapes as well: dogs, coyotes, something that might have been a deer, something else that could have been human. The Chupacabra weren't picky about their prey. Anything with blood would do. The barn door hung open, swaying gently in the pre-dawn breeze. Inside, Maya could hear sounds: the wet rustling of scales, the slow breathing of sleeping predators, the occasional hiss of a creature dreaming of the hunt. Marcus held up a hand, signaling for the team to stop. He pointed to the roof, to a gap where the corrugated metal had rusted away. A point of entry, a way to attack from above while the others blocked the exits. They split up, Marcus and Maya circling to the back while Baptiste and Sarah took positions at the front. The plan was simple. Marcus would drop through the roof, creating a diversion, while Maya covered him from the ground. Sarah and Baptiste would prevent escape, burning anything that tried to flee. Simple, dangerous, probably suicidal. Marcus climbed silently, finding purchase on the weathered boards, pulling himself up to the roof with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Maya watched him go, then moved to her position, pressing herself against the barn wall, listening to the sounds within. She heard them breathing, all 6 of them, their combined exhalations creating a rhythm like a bellows. She heard them moving in their sleep, tails lashing, claws scraping against the dirt floor. She heard something else too, something that made her blood run cold, a smaller sound, higher pitched, like the mewling of kittens. Young, the chupacabra had young. The implications hit her like a physical blow. If they killed the adults, the young would die, starve, become easy prey for predators. But if they left them, if they showed mercy, the creatures would grow, multiply, continue the cycle. There was no clean solution, no moral victory. Just death and more death, until one side or the other was extinct. She thought of her father, of his obsession, of the way he had sacrificed everything, his career, his reputation, his life, to prove that these creatures existed. She thought of the rancher Hank Morrison, drained dry on his own porch. She thought of the others, the hundreds of victims across 2 continents, the people who had died screaming in the night while the world refused to believe. Mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford. Now, Marcus's voice whispered through her earpiece, and then the roof exploded. He came through like thunder, his body silhouetted against the dawn light, his automatic weapon spitting fire. The chupacabra woke instantly, hissing, screeching, moving with terrifying speed. Maya saw them in the flashes of muzzle fire. 6 adult creatures, spines flared, red eyes glowing, tails whipping like weapons. She fired, the shotgun bucking against her shoulder, the buckshot catching one of the creatures in the flank. It screamed, a sound that vibrated in her bones, and turned toward her, its eyes locking onto her position. "Move," Marcus shouted, and Maya didn't think, just ran, diving through the barn door as the creature lunged at the space she had occupied. Outside, Baptiste and Sarah were already engaged. 2 chupacabra had tried to flee through the front entrance, only to be met with a wall of flame. Sarah's flamethrower caught one of them, the creature's scales igniting like dry tinder, its screams filling the air with a sound like tearing metal. The other dodged, its speed incredible, its body a blur of motion that defied tracking. It was on Baptiste before the trapper could react, claws raking his chest, tail blade scoring his thigh. Baptiste went down, blood spraying, and Sarah turned her weapon toward the creature, filling the air with fire. Maya emerged from the barn, breathless, her shotgun empty. She dropped it, drew her sidearm, a .45 loaded with incendiary rounds that Marcus had sourced from who knew where, and fired at the creature attacking Baptiste. The round caught it in the shoulder, the phosphorus igniting, burning through scales and flesh like acid. The chupacabra screamed and turned, abandoning Baptiste, focusing on her. She fired again, emptying the magazine as the creature advanced, its wounds healing even as new ones opened, its eyes burning with a rage that transcended pain. Then Marcus was there, his combat knife flashing, burying itself to the hilt in the creature's neck. The chupacabra thrashed, its tail whipping, its claws tearing at Marcus's arms. He held on, twisting the blade, using his weight to drive the creature to the ground. "Finish it," he roared, and Maya grabbed Sarah's flamethrower, jamming the nozzle against the creature's head, and pulled the trigger. The fire consumed it. The chupacabra burned, screamed, thrashed, but Marcus held it down, and Maya kept the flame on it until there was nothing left but ash and the stench of sulfur and cooked meat. 4 down, 2 to go. Marcus was wounded, his arms torn by claws, but he was still standing. Baptiste was down, unconscious or dead. Maya couldn't tell, didn't have time to check. Sarah was reloading, her face pale but her hands steady. The barn was burning, the fire spreading from the hay to the walls to the roof. The remaining 2 chupacabra emerged from the inferno, their scales blackened but unbroken, their eyes glowing with fury. One of them carried something in its arms, one of the young, a creature barely 2 feet long, covered in scales that hadn't yet hardened. They were protecting their offspring. The realization hit Maya like a blow. These weren't dumb animals. They were parents defending their young, fighting with a desperation that only family could inspire. "The young one," she shouted, pointing. "Aim for the young one." Marcus understood instantly. He raised his weapon, not at the adult carrying the young, but at the young itself. The chupacabra saw the threat, hissed, shielded its offspring with its body. "Drop your weapons," Maya commanded, her voice steady despite her fear, "or we kill the child." The chupacabra froze. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the burning barn, the distant calling of birds, the breathing of injured humans and wounded cryptids. Then the creature holding the young slowly, carefully, set it on the ground. It looked at Maya, and in its red eyes she saw something she hadn't expected. Not just rage, not just hunger, intelligence, understanding, recognition. "We know you," it seemed to say, though it made no sound. "We have always known you. You are the daughter of the hunter. You are marked." Maya didn't lower her weapon, step back, away from the young. The chupacabra obeyed, moving slowly, its spines drooping, its tail dragging in the dirt. The second adult followed, both creatures retreating toward the tree line, their eyes never leaving Maya's face. "We could kill them," Sarah whispered, her flamethrower still ready. "No," Maya said, "we let them go." "What?" Marcus demanded, his voice harsh with pain and adrenaline. "We came here to kill them, not negotiate." "They have young," Maya said. "If we kill them, the young die. If we let them go, they take the young, they leave, they don't come back." "And if they do come back?" Baptiste asked, his voice weak from where he lay on the ground, pressing a hand to his bleeding thigh. "Then we kill them," Maya said. "But not today. Today we give them a chance." The chupacabra understood. They gathered the young, one of them picking it up gently, carefully, with a tenderness that belied their monstrous appearance. They looked at Maya one last time, a look that spoke of future encounters, of debts unpaid, of battles yet to come. Then they turned and vanished into the woods, moving with a speed that made tracking impossible. Maya lowered her weapon, her hands shaking, her legs weak. She had done it. She had faced the monsters, survived the battle, made the choice that her father never could. She had shown mercy, and she had lived. But as she looked at the burning barn, at the ashes of the creatures she had killed, at the blood of her friends soaking into the Texas dirt, she knew that this was not the end. It was the beginning. The chupacabra would remember this day. They would return, stronger, smarter, more prepared. And she would be waiting. The news from India arrived 3 weeks later. Dejo Thomas, the scientist Maya had seen in the slaughterhouse footage, had been found dead, his team slaughtered, his research destroyed. The chupacabra had spread across Asia, following the drought, multiplying in the chaos of climate change and human suffering. Reports came from Africa next, then Europe, then Australia. The creatures were everywhere now, establishing territories, building nests, raising young. Governments scrambled to respond, but they were too slow, too skeptical, too committed to rational explanations to face the truth. Maya watched it all from her father's study, surrounded by his research, planning her next move. The team had grown, survivors from around the world, people who had faced the creatures and lived, who knew the truth and were willing to fight. They had established cells in 12 countries, networks of hunters and scientists and soldiers preparing for the war that was coming. The chupacabra were organizing too. Maya could see it in the patterns, the coordinated attacks, the strategic choices that went beyond animal instinct. They were intelligent, adaptable, learning from their encounters with humanity. They were evolving. And there were other creatures too. Reports of Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest, of Loch Ness-type creatures in lakes across the world, of things in the deep ocean that defied classification. The chupacabra weren't alone. They were part of something larger, an ecosystem of cryptids that was emerging from hiding as the world changed. Maya's father's research had hinted at this, had suggested that the chupacabra were part of an ancient order of creatures that had ruled the earth before humanity. They had gone into hiding, into the shadows, waiting for the right conditions to return. Now those conditions were here: climate change, habitat destruction, human overpopulation. The balance was shifting, and the old creatures were reclaiming their territory. The final battle would not be fought in a barn in Texas. It would be fought across the world, in cities and forests and mountains, humanity against the monsters that had waited millennia for their chance. Maya stood at the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of red that reminded her of blood. Her father's journals were spread on the table behind her, open to passages she had read 100 times. The answer was there somewhere, hidden in the old man's obsession. "There's never just one," she whispered, repeating the words of the old trapper who had started this journey with her. "There's never just one." She understood now. The Chupacabra weren't invading. They were returning. This was their world, had always been their world, and humanity was just the latest species to try to claim it. The war wasn't about survival. It was about dominance, and humanity was losing. But Maya Carter wasn't ready to surrender. She had survived the slaughterhouse. She had faced the creatures in the barn. She had learned their weaknesses, their patterns, their ways. She would teach others, build an army, take the fight to the monsters in their dens. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, the Chupacabra were hunting, feeding, multiplying. But somewhere else, humans were preparing, planning, fighting back. The war was coming, and Maya Carter would be there to meet it. She turned from the window, picked up her father's journal, and began to read. The answers were there. She would find them, and she would use them to save the world. Or die trying. The blood moon rose over Texas, red and bloated, and beneath it the monsters hunted. But the hunters were hunting too. And the night was far from over. The Wendel Road Pact. Dr. Sarah Chen's boots sank into the Minnesota mud with a wet, sucking sound that seemed almost eager to consume her, to draw her down into the earth where so many others had already been swallowed. She stood at the edge of what the locals called the Mistinka River, though river was generous. It was more of a murky, slow-moving artery of brown water that wound through the pine forests like an infected vein. The air here tasted of copper and something older, something that made her teeth ache with a primal warning her rational mind tried to ignore. She was 43 years old, had a doctorate in forensic archaeology from the University of Chicago, had consulted on over 200 cases involving animal attacks across North America, and had never once believed in anything that couldn't be measured, cataloged, and explained through the lens of predator behavior and trauma analysis. But standing here, watching the late October fog curl between the skeletal birch trees like fingers testing the air for prey, she felt the first genuine chill of her career crawl up her spine and settle at the base of her skull. The remains had been discovered by a hiking couple 3 days prior, or rather, the husband had stumbled into them while relieving himself behind a granite outcropping. His screams had carried for half a mile, and when the sheriff's deputies arrived, they found him curled against the stone, his pants still around his ankles, his eyes fixed on something that had broken his mind in ways Sarah could already see would never fully heal. The woman had been found wandering the logging road in shock, her hiking boots caked with blood that wasn't her own. They were both in psychiatric care now, sedated and mute, their brains apparently choosing silence over the memory of whatever they had witnessed. Sarah squatted beside the excavation site her team had carefully opened over the past 36 hours. The grave was shallow, which was unusual for this part of the country where the soil ran deep, and the frost line kept the earth frozen solid for months. Someone or something hadn't bothered to dig deep. The bones had been partially exposed by spring runoff and the persistent gnawing of scavengers, but what remained was enough to tell Sarah that this was not a standard animal attack victim, nor was it a standard human burial. The skeletal remains belonged to what appeared to be a young adult male, perhaps in his early 20s, based on the fusion of the pelvic bones and the condition of the teeth. But the teeth were wrong. Sarah had spent years examining human remains, had cataloged dental records from hundreds of victims, and she knew the architecture of a human mouth like she knew her own reflection. These teeth were not human, not entirely. The canines had elongated, extending nearly an inch beyond the gum line, curving backward like the fangs of some carnivorous mammal. The enamel was thicker, denser, marked with microscopic striations that suggested a diet of raw meat, heavy tearing and shearing. The jaw structure itself had expanded, the mandible protruding slightly to accommodate these aberrations, and the zygomatic arches flared wider than they should, creating a skull that was recognizably human in its general proportions but grotesquely wrong in its specifics. "Dr. Chen, you're going to want to see this." The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, her graduate assistant from the University of Minnesota, a promising young anthropologist whose enthusiasm for the field had not yet been crushed by the realities of what they sometimes uncovered. He stood at the far edge of the excavation, his face pale beneath his Minnesota Gophers baseball cap, his hands trembling slightly as he held a soil sieve. Sarah rose from her crouch, her knees protesting after hours of careful brushwork, and made her way to where Marcus stood. He had uncovered a second set of remains, or rather, fragments of remains. These were older, much older, the bone bleached white by decades of exposure and chemically weathered by the acidic soil. But they showed the same abnormalities: the elongated canines, the flared cheekbones, the subtle elongation of the limbs that suggested someone had attempted to stand or run on legs that were no longer entirely configured for human bipedalism. "How many?" Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "7 so far," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And they're not all in one layer. This one here, the one I just found, it's maybe 6 feet down. The soil composition suggests it's been here since the 50s. But this other one, the one you were examining, that's fresh. Maybe 3-4 months at most. And there, see that discoloration in the soil strata? I think there are more, many more." Sarah looked at the exposed earth, reading the layers like a text written in dirt and time. Marcus was right. The grave site showed signs of repeated use, of bodies buried and partially unearthed and reburied over decades, perhaps longer. The soil chemistry would tell them more. Carbon dating would narrow the windows, but her instinct, her professional instinct that had never failed her, screamed that they were standing on top of a burial ground that had been active for generations. The coroner had already taken the first set of remains, the fresher ones, back to the county morgue in Fergus Falls. Sarah had read the preliminary report that morning, sitting in her rental car with the heater blasting against the October chill, and she had read it 3 times because she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The cause of death was listed as massive trauma, self-inflicted. The victim, identified as Derek Haverson, age 24, a local farmhand with no history of mental illness or self-harm, had apparently torn out his own throat with his bare hands. The fingernails had been found embedded in his laryngeal cartilage, his own skin under them. His cervical vertebrae showed signs of partial dislocation from the force of his grip. His own blood had filled his lungs as he drowned in it. And somehow, impossibly, the report noted that the trauma appeared to have been inflicted while he was still conscious and fighting, based on the defensive wounds on his palms where he had apparently tried to stop himself. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Bud Vickers who had been law enforcement in this county for 30 years and looked like he had aged 60 in the last 2, had told Sarah that Derek Haverson had been found by his brother near the riverbank, his body already cold, his hands still clawed around his ruined throat. There were no other marks on him, no signs of struggle, no indication that anyone else had been present. Just a young man who had apparently decided to rip out his own throat while standing alone in the woods at dawn. But that wasn't what the bones were telling her. The bones were telling her that Derek Haverson had been changing. The epiphyseal plates in his long bones showed signs of recent stress fractures, as if his skeleton had been trying to grow, to reconfigure itself in impossible ways. The muscle attachment sites on his scapulae were enlarged, suggesting massive hypertrophy that had occurred over weeks rather than years. His feet, God, his feet, were the worst. The tarsal bones had begun to fuse in patterns that didn't match any human anatomy chart Sarah had ever studied. They looked like they were trying to become something else, something built for running on 4 legs rather than walking on 2. She spent another 4 hours at the site, supervising the careful extraction of the older remains, photographing every inch of the excavation, collecting soil samples and insect evidence that might help establish a timeline. By the time the sun began to set behind the pine forest, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds that seemed too aggressive for the season, she had cataloged 11 separate burials spanning what she estimated to be 70 years or more. All showed the same dental abnormalities. All showed signs of skeletal transformation. All had died by their own hands, according to the sparse records she could access, deaths ruled as suicides, hunting accidents, or, in 3 cases from the 1970s, animal attacks that had somehow left no predator DNA and no evidence of external struggle. The drive back to Fergus Falls took 40 minutes, the rental car's headlights cutting through fog that grew denser with each mile, until Sarah felt like she was piloting a submarine through an ocean of gray. She checked into the North Country Inn, a generic roadside motel that smelled of industrial cleaner and ancient cigarette smoke, and she sat on the edge of the bed with her laptop open to her case files, trying to find patterns in the chaos. The sightings had started in 2009, or at least that's when the first documentation appeared. A hunter named Frank Delacroix had been tracking a 12-point buck through the early morning mist near the Mistinka River when his dashcam, mounted to his ATV for insurance purposes, had captured something that still gave Sarah pause every time she watched it. The footage was grainy, the quality poor, but there was no mistaking the figure that moved through the trees in the background. It was bipedal, roughly human-sized, but it moved wrong. The joints seemed to bend in directions that weren't possible, the limbs too long for the torso, the head hanging at an angle that suggested a neck capable of rotating in ways no human spine could manage. It dragged something behind it, later identified as a deer carcass, though how a single figure could carry a 200-pound buck with one hand while moving through dense forest was never explained. And the audio, enhanced by the state crime lab, captured sounds that had no business coming from anything human. Guttural growls, layered and complex, like multiple voices trying to speak through the same throat. The wet cracking of bones being broken, not for marrow but for the sound itself, for the pleasure of destruction. And underneath it all, barely audible but present in the spectrographic analysis, a rhythm that almost resembled language, words in a dialect that no linguist had been able to identify. Frank Delacroix had been found the next morning by his hunting partner, his throat torn out, his fingernails embedded in his own larynx. The sheriff had ruled it a suicide, suggesting that Delacroix had suffered some kind of psychotic break and done the damage to himself. But the dashcam footage had vanished from the evidence locker, accidentally, recorded over according to the chain of custody log, and only a single frame remained, printed by a deputy who had apparently had the sense to make a backup before the original disappeared. Sarah had that print in her motel room now, pinned to the corkboard above the desk, and she stared at it as the night deepened outside her window. The figure in the photograph was blurry, caught mid-stride, but there was something about the posture, the angle of the head that made her think of animals, of predators. It wasn't walking like a human. It was walking like something that had learned to walk, something that remembered how it used to move on 4 legs and resented every second of this new, awkward configuration. Her phone rang at 11:47 p.m., startling her so badly that she knocked her coffee cup off the desk. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, a local exchange. Dr. Chen. The voice was male, young, with the rough edges of someone who smoked too much and slept too little. This is she. Who is this? My name is Lyle Carter. I'm a journalist with the Minnesota Independent. I've been trying to reach you for 2 days, but the sheriff's office wouldn't give me your number. I had to bribe a desk clerk at the coroner's office. I apologize for the hour, but I didn't think you'd want me to wait until morning." Sarah pinched the bridge of her nose. "Mr. Carter, I don't give interviews about active investigations, and it's after midnight." "I know about the bodies," Carter said, and there was something in his tone, an urgency that bordered on panic that made Sarah pause. "I know about the teeth. I know about the pact. And I know that whatever you found out there in the woods, it's not going to stay buried. It never does." "What pact?" Sarah asked despite herself. "The Wendel Road Pact," Carter said, and in the background Sarah could hear the clink of glass against glass, the sound of someone pouring liquid courage. 19th century. Settlers. They made a deal, Dr. Chen. They made a deal with something that lived here before the Ojibwe, before the Dakota, before anyone kept written records, and the terms of that deal are still being enforced. Sarah should have hung up. She should have told him to contact her through official channels, through the university's public relations department. She should have done 100 things that would have kept her safely distant from whatever madness this journalist was peddling. Instead, she found herself asking, "Where are you?" "I'm at a bar in Fergus Falls called the Rusty Anchor. It's on Main Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse. I'll buy you a cup of coffee that tastes slightly better than battery acid, and I'll show you why Frank Delacroix really died. I'll show you why those bodies in the woods aren't just remains, they're warnings." Sarah looked at the photograph on her wall, at the blurred figure with its 2 long arms and its head hung at that predatory angle. She thought about Derek Haverson's elongated canines, about the stress fractures in his bones that suggested his body had been trying to become something else, something that walked on 4 legs and hunted in the dark. She thought about the coroner who had ruled self-inflicted throat trauma on a man whose own fingernails were embedded in his larynx. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said, and hung up before she could change her mind. The Rusty Anchor was exactly what its name suggested, a wooden building that had seen better decades, its sign missing several letters so that it read He Rusty Ancor, the parking lot half full of pickup trucks and rusted sedans. Sarah found Lyle Carter in a corner booth, a man in his early 30s with hollow cheeks and nervous hands that never stopped moving, constantly adjusting his glasses, drumming on the table, shredding a paper napkin into confetti. He had spread documents across the booth like a patient laying out their symptoms for diagnosis. Newspaper clippings yellowed with age, photocopied diary pages written in spidery cursive, police reports with sensitive information poorly redacted, and photographs, so many photographs, of bodies in various states of destruction. Sarah had seen death before, had made it her profession to read the stories written in bone and trauma, but something about these images made her want to look away, made her want to burn them and pretend she had never seen what they revealed. "You're here," Carter said, and his smile was the desperate grin of a drowning man who had finally found someone willing to throw him a rope. "I wasn't sure you'd come. Most people don't. Most people hear Pact and Wendel Road and they think I'm crazy, or they think I'm pitching a horror movie script. But you're different. You've seen the teeth." "I don't know what I've seen," Sarah said carefully, sliding into the booth and ordering a coffee from the waitress who materialized at her elbow. "I know what the bones are telling me, but bones can be misleading. Trauma can create abnormalities. Post-mortem changes can mimic." "Don't," Carter interrupted, his hand shooting out to grasp her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't do the scientific rationalization thing. Not yet. Not until you've heard the whole story. The Wendel Road Pact wasn't a legend, Dr. Chen. It was a contract, written in blood and kept in faith for over 150 years. And someone broke it. Someone broke it, and now the old wolves are collecting their due." He pulled a leather-bound journal from his bag, the cover cracked and stained with what Sarah desperately hoped was coffee. The pages were filled with handwriting that grew progressively more erratic as it progressed, the early entries neat and precise, the later ones jagged and frantic, words scrawled in margins and spiraling around the page edges like something trying to escape. "This belonged to my great-great-grandfather," Carter said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Ezekiel Carter. He was one of the first white settlers in this part of Minnesota. Came here in 1847 with his wife and 3 children, built a cabin on what was then called Wendel Road, though it wasn't much of a road, just a track through the woods the Ojibwe used for seasonal hunting. The winter of 1848 was brutal. The snow came early and didn't stop. By January they were starving. The game had fled, the stored provisions were gone, and Ezekiel's youngest daughter, Mary, was dying of fever." Carter opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon, the paper so brittle it threatened to crumble at his touch. "This is the entry from January 17th, 1848. Write it. Read what he wrote." Sarah leaned forward, squinting at the faded ink. "The howling came again tonight, closer than before. The children cry and hide beneath the bed, but Mary is too weak to move. I took my rifle to the door, ready to shoot whatever beast had come to claim us, but what stood in the moonlight was no wolf. It stood like a man, but its eyes were yellow, and its hands were claws, and when it spoke in words that I understood though I had never heard them before. It said, 'Your kind takes what is not yours, your kind destroys what you cannot consume. But I am old and I am patient and I know hunger. I will spare your children, Ezekiel Carter. I will spare them from the winter that kills, but in return you will feed me. You will bring me those who wander, those who are lost, those who will not be missed. And when your children's children forget, I will remind them, I am always hungry, I am always waiting.'" Sarah looked up from the page, her coffee forgotten, cold and oily in front of her. "This is a story, Mr. Carter, a campfire tale. People don't make pacts with whatever this is describing." "Don't they?" Carter asked, his eyes bright with something that wasn't quite madness but was definitely adjacent to it. "What would you do, Dr. Chen? What would you do if something stood outside your door and offered you a choice, your children or the strangers who wander into your woods? If the choice was feed it or watch your baby starve?" He pulled out another document, a photocopy of a census record from 1850. 3 years after that entry, the population of Wendel Road Township was listed as 47 people. By 1855, it was 53. But here's the thing. The state records show that in those 5 years, there were 28 deaths recorded as exposure or lost in woods or unknown cause. 28 people who wandered into that forest and never came out. And during the same period, not a single child under the age of 12 died. Not one. In a frontier settlement where infant mortality should have been 30%, where disease and accident should have taken their toll, every child lived. Every single one. Sarah felt the weight of the numbers, the impossibility of them. Correlation isn't causation. Just because children survive doesn't mean. "There's more," Carter interrupted, sliding another photograph across the table. This one was modern, taken with a digital camera, showing a clearing in the woods that Sarah recognized, the same granite outcropping where she had spent her day excavating. But in this photograph, taken at night with the flash casting harsh shadows, there was something standing in the clearing. Something tall, bent at the waist, its arms hanging almost to the ground, its face turned toward the camera with eyes that reflected the flash back like twin points of hellish light. "This was taken by a game camera 3 weeks ago," Carter said. 3 weeks before Derek Haverson's body was found. And this," he pulled out his phone and opened a video file. "This was recorded by Frank Delacroix's dashcam in 2009. The original was destroyed, but Frank emailed a copy to his brother the night before he died. His brother kept it. He's kept it for 15 years, terrified to show anyone, terrified not to." The video played on the small screen, and Sarah watched as the grainy footage showed the figure moving through the trees, dragging the deer carcass. But Carter had enhanced the audio, and through the phone's speaker came sounds that made Sarah's skin try to crawl off her bones. The growls, yes, she had heard those in the crime lab enhancement, but there was more here. Underneath the growls, running parallel to them, was a voice. human-sounding enough to recognize as language, but twisted, warped, stretched across vocal cords that weren't meant to produce human speech. "It speaks," Carter said, his own voice barely audible over the recording. "It learns, it remembers, and when the pact is broken, when the offerings stop, it doesn't just hunt, it transforms, it makes more of itself." He paused the video and pulled up another file, a PDF of the coroner's report on Frank Delacroix. "Read the toxicology. Read what they found in his blood." Sarah scanned the document, her professional eye catching the anomalies immediately. Cortisol levels that were off the charts, enough stress hormones to kill a horse. Adrenaline concentrations that suggested his heart should have exploded. And something else, something that didn't have a name in standard toxicology databases. A compound that the lab had marked as unidentified organic substance, possibly fungal or bacterial in origin. "They found the same thing in Derek Haverson," Carter said. "And in the other victims. Whatever it is, it's not natural. It's not anything that should exist in a human bloodstream. But it's there in every single person who died by their own hand after encountering that thing. It's changing them, Dr. Chen. It's making them into something else. Something that can carry on the pact even after they're dead." Sarah looked at the photographs, at the journal, at the video frozen on Carter's phone screen. She thought about her own excavation, about the 11 bodies she had cataloged that day, about the elongated canines and the skeletal transformations and the burial ground that had been active for generations. She thought about the teeth, those impossible teeth, and about what it would take to make a human jaw grow fangs. "Why me?" she asked. "Why show me all of this?" Carter's nervous hands went still for the first time since she had arrived. "Because you're next," he said quietly. "Because you disturbed the burial ground. Because you dug up the bones. The pact isn't just about feeding anymore, Dr. Chen. It's about silence. It's about keeping the secret, and you've seen too much. You've touched what shouldn't be touched." He reached into his bag one final time and withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, covered in the same spidery handwriting as the journal. "This is the last entry, the one my great-great-grandfather wrote before he died. Read it, and then decide if you want to run or if you want to fight, but decide quickly, because it already knows your name. It smelled you the moment you set foot on its ground." Sarah unfolded the paper with hands that trembled despite her best efforts at control. The handwriting was barely legible, the letters shaky and uneven, as if written by someone in the grip of fever or terror or both. "They are not wolves, they never were, they are what wolves fear. They are the reason wolves howl at the moon to warn each other, to warn us. But we stopped listening. We made our deals and we forgot the price. And now they are waking. Now they are hungry. God help us. God help us all." Outside the bar, somewhere in the fog-shrouded streets of Fergus Falls, a dog began to howl. The sound was wrong somehow, too deep, too complex, carrying harmonics that no canine throat should have been able to produce. It rose and fell in a rhythm that sounded almost like laughter, almost like words, and when it finally faded, Sarah realized she had been holding her breath. "What do we do?" she asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. Carter gathered his papers, his movements suddenly precise and controlled. "We find the witness," he said. "The one from 2009. Frank Delacroix's hunting partner. He's still alive, if you can call it that. He's been hiding in a cabin near Long Prairie, drinking himself to death, waiting for someone to believe him. He saw what happened to Frank. He saw what the thing did, what it said, how it moved. And he knows where to find it. He knows where it sleeps." "And then what?" Sarah asked. "If we find it, if we see what you say is out there, what do we do then?" Carter looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and hoped for too little. "Then we finish what my great-great-grandfather started," he said. "We break the pact, and we pray that whatever happens next, we survive long enough to regret it." They left the bar at 1:30 a.m., stepping out into air that had grown impossibly colder, carrying the metallic taste of snow that wasn't in the forecast. The fog had thickened, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet, and as Sarah walked to her car, she could have sworn she heard footsteps behind her, not Carter's, heavier, accompanied by the sound of something moving on 4 legs that was trying to walk on 2. She didn't turn around. She didn't dare. She got in her car and drove back to the motel with her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached, and she didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the fog, waiting for something to emerge from it, something with too many joints and eyes that reflected light like burning coals. It didn't come, not that night, but in her dreams it spoke to her with her own voice, and it told her exactly what it was going to do with her bones. The drive to Long Prairie took 90 minutes through pine forests that seemed to close in around the highway like walls, their branches intertwining overhead to form a tunnel of perpetual twilight. Sarah drove while Carter navigated, his hands never still, constantly checking his phone for messages that never came, adjusting his seatbelt, drumming his fingers against the dashboard in a rhythm that was starting to make her teeth ache. She had managed 3 hours of restless sleep at the motel, waking every 20 minutes with the certainty that something was standing outside her window, watching her with yellow eyes that didn't blink. "Tell me about the 1999 case," she said, breaking the silence that had stretched for 30 miles. "The Air Force guard, what happened to him?" Carter's drumming stopped. "His name was Technical Sergeant David Morrow," he said, his voice taking on the flat cadence of someone reciting facts they had memorized to keep the horror at bay. 26 years old, stationed at the radar installation in St. Louis County, about 40 miles from where we're heading. Standard patrol route through the forest, checking the perimeter fence, making sure no one was trying to access the restricted area. His truck was found at 600 hours, abandoned on a logging road 3 miles from the base. He pulled a file from his bag, spreading photocopied police reports across his lap. The interior of the truck was destroyed, not vandalized, destroyed. The seats had been shredded, the stuffing pulled out and scattered like something had been searching for something hidden inside. The dashboard was crushed inward, the steering wheel bent at a 45-degree angle as if it had been twisted by hands too strong to be human. The M16 rifle that was standard issue for patrols was found outside the vehicle, bent into a crescent shape. The barrel snapped off, the stock splintered. Sarah glanced at the photographs Carter held up. The rifle looked like it had been subjected to industrial machinery, not human strength. The metal had folded like paper, the polymer stock shattered into fragments. "Morrow's body was found 50 yards from the truck," Carter continued. "He had crawled that distance on his hands and knees, leaving a trail of blood and vomit and something else, something the lab couldn't identify. His face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his mouth open in a scream that no one had heard. His eyes were hemorrhaged, every blood vessel burst from the pressure of whatever he had seen. But that wasn't what killed him." Carter's voice dropped to a whisper. The autopsy showed that his heart had literally burst. The muscle walls had torn apart from the inside, flooding his chest cavity with blood. His adrenal glands were 3 times their normal size, flooded with hormones. The toxicology report showed cortisol levels that were biologically impossible, enough to kill a dozen men. The official cause of death was massive myocardial rupture secondary to extreme physiological stress. The unofficial cause, the one the Air Force buried so deep it took me 3 years to find it, was fear. David Morrow died because his body couldn't process the terror of what he had seen. His heart exploded because it couldn't pump fast enough to keep up with his panic. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter. "And the dash cam, did he have a camera?" "He did," Carter said, "but the tape was blank, not erased blank. 45 minutes of footage showing him driving, checking the perimeter, and then static. Just static with audio that sounded like breathing, something breathing in the cab with him, something that wasn't him. And then at the 42-minute mark, a voice, not Morrow's, something else. speaking words that the audio technicians couldn't transcribe in a language that didn't match any known phonetic pattern. They drove in silence for another 20 minutes, the pine forest pressing closer around them. When they finally reached Long Prairie, it was a town of barely 2,000 people, a single main street with boarded-up storefronts, and a gas station that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in weeks. The address Carter had scrawled on a napkin led them to a dirt road that wound into the hills, climbing past abandoned farms and collapsed barns until the trees closed in completely. The cabin sat at the end of a quarter-mile driveway, barely more than a shack with a corrugated metal roof and plastic sheeting over the windows. An ancient pickup truck sat in the yard, its bed filled with empty beer cans and firewood. As Sarah parked, she saw movement behind one of the plastic-sheeted windows, a figure watching them approach, then disappearing into the shadows. Carter knocked on the door 3 sharp raps. "Mr. Holloway, my name is Lyle Carter. We spoke on the phone. I've brought someone who needs to see the footage." The door opened a crack, revealing a bloodshot eye and the barrel of a shotgun. "Show me your hands," a voice rasped. "Both of you, show me your hands right now." They raised their hands, palms out, fingers spread. The eye scanned them, suspicious and wild, and then the door opened wider to reveal a man in his 50s who looked like he had aged 20 years in the last 15. Danny Holloway had been Frank Delacroix's hunting partner, the man who had found his body, and the years since had not been kind. His skin was the color of old parchment, stretched over bones that seemed too sharp to be healthy. His hands shook constantly, the tremor visible even from a distance, and his eyes, his eyes, held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen something that had broken him in ways that could never be repaired. "You're the bone lady," Holloway said, squinting at Sarah. "The one they got digging up the old graves." "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen," she said carefully. "I'm a forensic archaeologist. I'm trying to understand what's happening." Holloway laughed, a sound like dry leaves scraping concrete. "Understand, you want to understand." He stepped back from the door, the shotgun held loosely in one hand. "Come on in then. Come see what understanding gets you." The cabin's interior was a monument to decay and alcoholism. Empty bottles covered every surface, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and unwashed flesh. A wood stove in the corner provided the only heat, burning low and casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. But what caught Sarah's attention was the wall above the stove, covered in photographs and newspaper clippings and handwritten notes connected by strands of red yarn that formed patterns she couldn't decipher. "My research," Holloway said, gesturing with the shotgun. 15 years of trying to figure out what I saw, what I heard, what it did to Frank." He pulled a laptop from beneath a pile of dirty clothes, the screen cracked but functional. "You saw the dashcam footage Carter showed you. The grainy shit from Frank's ATV. That's the cleaned-up version. This is the original. This is what Frank saw in the last 5 minutes of his life." The video loaded slowly, the compression artifacts making the already poor quality even worse. But Sarah could see the familiar setting, the early morning forest, the mist rising from the ground, the hunter's perspective as the ATV moved slowly through the trees. The timestamp in the corner showed 5:47 a.m., October 17, 2009. "Watch," Holloway whispered. "Watch the right side of the screen, that's where it comes from." At 5:52, something moved in the trees. Sarah leaned closer, her professional detachment crumbling as she saw it clearly for the first time. It wasn't just a blurry figure. It was tall, taller than a man should be, bent at the waist so that its arms hung nearly to the ground. The arms themselves were wrong, too long, bending at joints that didn't match human anatomy. It moved on 2 legs, but awkwardly, as if walking were a skill it had learned but never mastered, a creature more comfortable on 4 limbs that was forcing itself into an unnatural posture. And then it turned and Sarah saw its face. She wanted to scream. She wanted to look away. But she couldn't do either, her eyes locked on the screen as the thing turned its head with a motion that was utterly inhuman, its neck rotating too far, too smoothly like an owl's. The face was almost human, almost recognizable as something that might have once been a man, but twisted, stretched, the jaw elongated to accommodate teeth that gleamed white and sharp in the early light. The eyes were the worst, yellow, with vertical pupils like a cat's, reflecting the camera's light with a glow that seemed to come from within rather than from without. "It's looking at the camera," Carter said, his voice barely audible. "No," Holloway corrected. "It's looking at Frank. It's looking through the camera at Frank. It's always looking at the person watching." The thing on the screen opened its mouth, and the sound that came out made Sarah's stomach clench with a terror she couldn't rationalize. It was language, or something like language, syllables arranged in patterns that suggested meaning, spoken in a voice that was simultaneously a growl and a whisper and something else, something that sounded almost like her own voice reflected back at her. "It's saying something," Carter said. "Can you enhance the audio?" Holloway nodded, clicking a few keys. The video rewound, played again with the audio isolated and amplified. The words were clearer now, still distorted but recognizable. "The pact holds. The children live. But you, Frank Delacroix, grandson of Ezekiel, you have forgotten. You have broken faith, and now you must pay." Frank's grandfather was Ezekiel Carter's neighbor, Holloway explained, his voice shaking. "The bloodline thing, it's real. It tracks the families. It remembers who made the deals." On the screen, the thing began to move toward the camera, its gait improving with each step, becoming more fluid, more human-like, but somehow worse for the mimicry. At 10 feet, it stopped, and Sarah saw its hands clearly for the first time, fingers that were too long, tipped with claws that retracted and extended like a cat's, the nails black and curved and sharp enough to slice through flesh like paper. "It touched him," Holloway whispered. "It reached through the screen and touched him. I saw it. I was there 20 yards away watching through my scope. It reached out and it touched his face, and Frank screamed, and then he started tearing at his own throat. He ripped out his own throat while that thing watched and laughed." The video ended, the timestamp showing 5:58 a.m. 2 minutes of footage from first sighting to Frank Delacroix's death, captured in grainy detail that would never convince anyone who hadn't seen it themselves. "Why didn't it kill you?" Sarah asked Holloway, the question coming out before she could stop it. Holloway's bloodshot eyes met hers, and in them she saw the answer before he spoke. "Because I ran," he said. "Because I left Frank there and I ran, and I didn't stop running until I reached the highway. Because the pact doesn't care about cowards. It only cares about those who break faith. I didn't break faith. I just didn't have any to begin with." He turned away from her, staring at his wall of research. "But you, Dr. Chen, you broke faith, you disturbed the graves, you touched the bones, you dug up what should have stayed buried, and it's noticed you, it smelled you. The howling you heard last night, that was it. That was it calling your name." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. I didn't make any pact. My family has nothing to do with." "It doesn't matter," Holloway interrupted. "The pact isn't about who made it anymore. It's about territory. It's about the boundary between what sleeps and what wakes. And by digging up those bones, you cross the boundary. You woke something that should have stayed asleep." He turned back to them, his expression suddenly urgent, almost desperate. "You need to leave this place, both of you. Go back to the cities, back where the lights are bright and the forests are small and tame. Forget what you've seen. Destroy the footage. Burn the research. Pretend none of this ever happened. Because if you stay, if you keep digging, it will find you. It will find you and it will make you one of them. That's what the transformation is, Dr. Chen. That's what the teeth mean, what the bones mean. It's not evolution. It's recruitment. It's turning people into more of itself." Carter stepped forward, his hands out in a placating gesture. "Mr. Holloway, we can't just run. People are dying. Derek Haverson died 3 weeks ago. The burial ground had 11 bodies, possibly more. If this thing is still active, if it's still recruiting, then we need to stop it. We need to find a way to end the pact. Holloway laughed again, that dry, broken sound. End the pact? You want to end the pact? He reached behind the wood stove and pulled out a leather bag, ancient and cracked, that clinked with the sound of metal on metal. My great-grandfather tried to end the pact in 1923. He was a minister, thought he could drive it out with prayer and holy water. It tore his legs off and made him watch while it ate them. My grandfather tried in 1956. He came out here with a hunting rifle and silver bullets he ordered from some occult catalog. It used his own rifle to beat him to death. My father tried in 1989. He burned down the cabin where it slept, or where we thought it slept. The fire spread, took out 300 acres of forest and killed 2 firefighters. My father was found 3 days later, hanging from a tree with his own intestines. The pact doesn't end, Mr. Carter. The pact only changes hands. He opened the leather bag and withdrew a small object, holding it out to Sarah. It was a tooth, yellowed with age, as long as her thumb and twice as thick, with serrated edges that looked sharp enough to cut skin. This is from the first one, Holloway said. The one that made the deal with Ezekiel Carter. It's been passed down in my family for 5 generations. They say if you carry it, if you keep it close, it can't see you, can't smell you. I don't know if that's true, but I've been carrying it for 15 years and I'm still alive. Sarah took the tooth, her skin crawling at the contact. It felt warm, impossibly warm, as if it had been pulled from a living mouth moments ago rather than centuries past. Why are you giving this to me? Because you're going to need it, Holloway said. Because you're not going to run. I can see it in your eyes. You're one of those people who has to know, who has to understand, even if understanding kills you. And because someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember after I'm gone. The pact demands witnesses, Dr. Chen. It demands that someone remember what was paid, what was sacrificed. If everyone forgets, if no one carries the memory, then the price comes due all at once. And nobody wants to see what happens when the old wolves collect their debt in full. They left Holloway's cabin as the sun began to set, the old man standing in his doorway watching them go with eyes that held no hope. Sarah drove back toward Fergus Falls with the tooth in her pocket, its warmth spreading through the fabric of her jeans like a small, insistent fire. Carter was silent for a long time, staring out at the darkening forest. Finally, he spoke. We need to find the next grave, the fresh one. Holloway said it would be near Long Prairie, somewhere the thing has been hunting recently. If we can examine it before the transformation completes, before the teeth fully develop, we might learn something. We might find a weakness. You heard what he said, Sarah replied. There's no weakness, there's no way to stop it, only to run. Then we'll run, Carter said. But not yet, not until we have proof, not until we have something that will make people believe. Because if we just disappear, if we just become 2 more names on the list of the lost, then nothing changes. The pact continues, the killings continue, and more people become whatever Derek Haverson was becoming. They spent the night at a bed and breakfast in Long Prairie, Sarah lying awake with the tooth clutched in her hand, listening to the sounds of the forest outside her window. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and then another, and then a third, their voices rising in a chorus that sounded almost like words, almost like laughter. In the morning, they met with Dr. Elena Ruiz, the county coroner who had examined Derek Haverson's body. She was a compact woman in her 40s with short black hair and skeptical eyes that regarded Sarah's credentials with the careful evaluation of someone who had learned not to trust academic titles. I've read your preliminary report, Ruiz said, sliding a folder across her desk. You're saying the skeletal changes are post-mortem, that something in the soil caused the teeth to elongate, the bones to warp. That's one possibility, Sarah said carefully, but I'm not convinced. I think the changes were antemortem. I think Derek Haverson was transforming while he was still alive. Ruiz's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or fear. "Show me what you found at the burial site." Sarah laid out her photographs, her notes, her measurements. She explained the dental abnormalities, the stress fractures in the long bones, the fusion patterns in the feet. She explained about the 11 bodies, the repeated use of the burial ground, the decades, possibly centuries, of activity. When she finished, Ruiz was quiet for a long time. Then she stood and walked to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a key from around her neck to unlock it. From within, she pulled a sealed evidence bag containing something that looked like a blood sample. "This is from the Haverson autopsy," she said. "I didn't include it in the official report because I couldn't explain it. The lab couldn't identify it. The state forensic people looked at it and told me to destroy it. They said it was probably contamination, probably some kind of fungal growth that had gotten into the sample during collection." She handed the bag to Sarah. Inside, the blood was wrong. It was too dark, almost black, and it moved slightly, rippling against the plastic as if it were alive. "I drew this from his femoral artery 6 hours after death," Ruiz continued. "Blood shouldn't move after death. It should clot, settle, separate into components. This kept moving, and it kept changing. Look at the edges." Sarah looked closely, using her phone's flashlight to illuminate the bag. At the edges of the blood sample, where it touched the plastic, she could see something growing. Thin filaments like fungal hyphae extending outward, searching, tasting the air through the barrier. "I think it's a pathogen," Ruiz said, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was describing. "Something infectious that spreads through bodily fluids, something that colonizes the host and rewrites them, changes them from the inside out. The skeletal transformations, the dental changes, they're not genetic. They're caused by this thing living in the blood, in the marrow, directing the body to reshape itself according to some blueprint." "Like a parasite," Sarah said. "Like a parasite," Ruiz agreed. "But intelligent, directed. The changes aren't random, Dr. Chen, they're purposeful. The teeth, the jaw structure, the limb elongation, they're all adaptations for predation, for hunting, for killing." "We need to exhume another body," Sarah said. "A fresh one, before the transformation completes. We need to see if this pathogen is present in all the victims, if it's the mechanism of whatever this is." Ruiz nodded slowly. "I know where there's another grave. A teenager went missing 3 weeks ago, name of Marcus Webb. Not your assistant," she added quickly, seeing Sarah's expression. "Different Marcus Webb. Local kid, 18 years old, disappeared from a party near the river. They found his body 2 days later, buried shallow in the pine forest. I did the autopsy yesterday. The changes were already starting. The canines were elongating. The bones were showing stress fractures, and his blood was already moving like this." "Can you take us there?" Carter asked. Ruiz looked at him, then at Sarah, then back at the sealed bag of living blood. "If I do this," she said, "if I help you dig up this grave and examine these remains, there's no going back. You understand that, right? The people who looked at this sample, the ones who told me to destroy it, they weren't just being cautious. They were scared. Whatever this is, it's not just a disease, it's not just a monster, it's something else. Something that doesn't follow the rules we understand." "I understand," Sarah said. "Then meet me tonight," Ruiz said. "Midnight. Bring shovels and lights, and bring whatever protection you think might help. Because if what I've read about the Wendel Road Pact is even partially true, we're not just digging up a body, we're digging up a debt, and debts always come due." They spent the afternoon preparing, buying equipment from a hardware store, loading Carter's truck with shovels and tarps and cameras. Sarah kept the tooth in her pocket, its warmth a constant reminder of what they were walking into. At 11:30 p.m., they met Ruiz at the edge of the pine forest, her face pale in the beam of her flashlight, her hands steady but her eyes wide with a fear she was trying to control. "The grave is half a mile in," she said. "Follow me and try to be quiet, the forest listens." They walked in silence, the only sounds their footsteps crunching through pine needles and the distant hooting of owls. The moon was full, casting enough light to navigate by, but the trees seemed to drink it in, creating pools of shadow that moved with them as they walked. The grave was exactly where Ruiz had described, a shallow depression in the earth marked by a scattering of fresh dirt and the smell of decay. They worked quickly, professionally, Ruiz directing them where to dig to avoid disturbing the remains. At 3 feet down, they hit the body. Marcus Webb had been buried in his party clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt that were already starting to rot. But the smell wasn't normal decomposition. It was sharper, more chemical, like ozone and copper mixed with something sweet and wrong. "Help me lift him," Ruiz said, and together they raised the body onto the tarp they had spread beside the grave. Sarah saw the changes immediately. Even in the 3 days since death, the transformation had accelerated. The jaw had elongated further, the teeth visible through the rotting lips now clearly fangs, long and sharp and white. The hands were twisted, the fingers elongated, the nails thickened and darkened into claws. But the worst was the eyes. They were open, staring up at the night sky, and they had changed color. The irises were yellow now, with vertical pupils that reflected the moonlight like a cat's. "My God," Carter whispered, "it's like he's still becoming, even now, even after death." "The pathogen doesn't stop," Ruiz said, her voice clinical despite her shaking hands. "It keeps working, keep changing, look at the skin." Sarah looked and felt her stomach lurch. The skin on Webb's arms and legs was splitting, peeling back to reveal new growth underneath. Hair was sprouting in thick patches, coarse and black, spreading across the body like a disease. The spine was visible through the rotting shirt, and it was wrong, the vertebrae elongated, additional segments forming where there should be none, creating a tail-like extension that twitched slightly as they watched. "It's still alive," Sarah breathed. "Some part of it is still alive." "No," Ruiz said, but she didn't sound convinced. "This is post-mortem change, cellular activity continuing after brain death. It's not conscious." As if in response to her words, Marcus Webb's hand twitched. Then his arm. Then his jaw opened, the fangs glistening, and a sound came from his throat. A growl, wet and bubbling with decomposition fluids, but unmistakably a growl. "Get back," Ruiz screamed, and they scrambled away as the body convulsed, muscles contracting in patterns that had nothing to do with normal post-mortem spasms. The spine arched, the nutil lashing, and the eyes, those terrible yellow eyes, rolled in their sockets to focus on Sarah. "You broke the pact," the thing whispered, and its voice was Webb's voice and something else, something older and hungrier. "You touched what is ours, you woke what sleeps, and now you must pay." It lunged, faster than should have been possible, its claws catching Sarah's jacket and tearing through the fabric like paper. She fell backward, the tooth falling from her pocket, and the thing screamed, a high, piercing shriek of pain and rage, as the tooth touched its skin. Carter was there, swinging a shovel, the metal blade connecting with the thing's head with a wet crunch that sent it sprawling. Ruiz had her gun out, a service weapon she must have brought for protection, and she emptied the magazine into the convulsing body, shots echoing through the forest like thunder. The thing stopped moving, finally truly stopped. But as they stared at it, panting, shaking, Sarah saw the wounds begin to close, the bullet holes sealing with new growth, the crushed skull rebuilding itself with a sound like wet knitting. "We need to burn it," she said, her voice hoarse. "We need to burn it now." They didn't have gasoline, but Carter had lighter fluid for the camp stove he kept in his truck. They doused the body, their hands shaking so badly they spilled as much as they poured, and then Ruiz used her cigarette lighter to set it alight. The flames were wrong color, green and blue, not orange and red, and the smoke smelled of chemicals and sulfur. The thing screamed as it burned, screamed in a voice that was Webb's and Delacroix's and Haverson's and others, dozens of others, all the victims of the pact crying out in shared agony. When it was over, When the flames died down to embers, they stood in a circle around the ashes, none of them speaking, all of them knowing that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "It knew your name," Ruiz said to Sarah, her voice barely above a whisper. "It said you broke the pact." "I dug up the graves," Sarah said. "I disturbed the burial ground." "It's more than that," Carter said. He had retrieved the tooth from where it had fallen and he held it out to Sarah. "It's about bloodlines. The pact tracks families. My family made the original deal. And Sarah, your family. Your grandmother was from Minnesota, wasn't she? From Fergus Falls." Sarah felt ice form in her chest. "How did you?" "I did research," Carter said. "After I found the journal, I traced everyone connected to the original settlers. Your grandmother was a Delacroix before she married. Frank Delacroix was your cousin, Sarah. Second cousin, once removed. And the pact remembers family." They walked back to their vehicles in silence, the weight of the revelation crushing them. At the edge of the forest, Ruiz stopped, her head cocked as if listening. "Do you hear that?" she asked. They listened. At first there was nothing but the normal night sounds, insects, owls, the wind in the trees. But then, faint but growing louder, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy footsteps, moving on two legs that were learning to walk, accompanied by the sound of something dragging through the pine needles behind it. "Run," Sarah whispered. They ran. They ran through the forest with branches whipping their faces and roots tripping their feet. Ran until their lungs burned and their legs screamed. Ran until they burst from the tree line and stumbled to their vehicles. Sarah didn't look back until she was in her car with the engine running and the doors locked, and when she did, she saw nothing but darkness. But in that darkness, 2 points of yellow light watched her and they didn't blink. She drove back to Fergus Falls with her foot on the floor, not caring about speed limits or traffic laws, not caring about anything but distance. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window with the tooth in her hand and a knife in the other, watching the fog gather and dissipate, waiting for something to emerge. It didn't come, but she knew it would. It always came eventually. The pact demanded payment and the debt was never truly settled. In the morning, she received a text from Ruiz. It was a photograph of her own front door, taken from the street. Written across it in what looked like blood were 3 words: "You broke the pact." And below it in smaller letters, "We are coming." Sarah didn't go back to her motel room. She drove straight to the Fergus Falls Police Department, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the steering wheel, and demanded to speak with Sheriff Bud Vickers. The desk sergeant took one look at her face, pale, drawn, eyes red-rimmed and wild, and called for the sheriff without asking questions. Vickers emerged from his office looking like a man who had aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were sunken, his jowls sagging, and when he saw Sarah, something flickered in his expression that she couldn't read. Fear, maybe, or resignation. "Dr. Chen," he said, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. "I was just about to call you. There's been an incident, a bad one. You need to come with me." They drove in Vickers' cruiser, the sheriff's hand steady on the wheel despite the circumstances. Sarah sat in the passenger seat with the tooth clutched in her fist, its warmth the only thing keeping her from screaming. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Long Prairie," Vickers said. "Todd County, family reunion, 14 people. They were having a barbecue celebrating someone's retirement. Neighbors heard screaming around midnight. By the time deputies arrived," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "You need to see it for yourself." The drive took 40 minutes, the radio crackling with static and dispatch calls that Vickers didn't answer. When they arrived at the property, a farmhouse on 10 acres of pine forest, Sarah understood why the sheriff had been reluctant to describe what they would find. The yard was a slaughterhouse. Blood covered everything: the grass, the trees, the side of the house, the picnic tables that had been overturned and shattered. Bodies were scattered across the property, some in pieces, some whole but twisted into positions that suggested agony beyond description. The smell was overwhelming, copper and bile and something else, something that reminded Sarah of the zoo on a hot summer day, the smell of predator urine and musk. "Officially, it's a bear attack," Vickers said, his voice flat. "Black bear, probably. Rabid, maybe. We'll put out warnings, tell people to stay inside after dark." "This wasn't a bear," Sarah said, her professional detachment reasserting itself despite the horror. She walked toward the nearest body, a woman in her 50s wearing a floral dress that was now soaked crimson. The wounds were wrong for a bear, too precise, too targeted. The throat was torn out, yes, but the wounds were clean, surgical, not the ragged tears of animal teeth. And there were other wounds, stranger wounds, scratches on the arms that were too straight, too even, as if made by claws that knew exactly where to cut. "Survivors," Vickers said, "2 of them, teenagers hid in the basement. They're at the hospital now, sedated, but they talked before the doctors put them under. They said it was a man, walking on all fours, whispering in a language they didn't recognize." "Ojibwe," Sarah said. "It was speaking Ojibwe." Vickers looked at her sharply. "How do you know that?" "Because I've heard it before," Sarah said. She moved to another body, a man in his 30s who had apparently tried to fight back. His hands were shredded, fingers missing, defensive wounds that had done nothing to stop the attack. But what made Sarah pause was his skull. It had been bitten through. The bite marks were human-sized but wrong, the jaw too wide, the teeth too numerous. Something had clamped its jaws around this man's head and bitten down with enough force to crack the cranium, to expose the brain within. The brain itself was missing, scooped out, leaving an empty cavity that stared up at the sky like a third eye. "It eats brains," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It eats the brains of its victims. That's how it learns, how it remembers, it consumes their memories." Vickers didn't respond. He was staring at something near the tree line, his face gray. Sarah followed his gaze and saw what had captured his attention. Footprints, human footprints, but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch too high, the heel too narrow. And they weren't walking prints. They were running prints, the kind made by something moving on all fours that occasionally rose to 2 legs, the stride too long, the gait uneven and predatory. "Dr. Chen," Vickers said quietly, "I need you to tell me what you know, everything. Because I've been sheriff for 30 years and I've seen things in these woods that I can't explain. I've seen bodies that don't make sense. I've signed death certificates that I knew were lies, and I'm tired. I'm tired of pretending." Sarah told him. She told him about the burial ground, about the elongated canines and the skeletal transformations. She told him about the pact, about Ezekiel Carter and the deal made in 1848. She told him about the pathogen, about the living blood, about the thing that had attacked them in the forest the night before. She showed him the tooth, still warm in her hand, and explained what Holloway had said about protection. When she finished, Vickers was silent for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his own talisman, a silver coin, worn smooth with age, hanging from a leather cord around his neck. "My grandfather gave me this," he said, "told me never to take it off, said it was blessed by a priest in 1920 after the last time something like this happened. I thought he was crazy, old world superstition, but I kept it just in case." He looked at the carnage around them, at the blood and the bodies and the footprints leading into the forest. "It's happening again, isn't it? Whatever happened in 1920, whatever my grandfather saw, it's happening again." "It never stopped," Sarah said. "It just sleeps, and now it's waking up." They spent the day documenting the scene, Sarah working with a professionalism she didn't feel, photographing every wound, every print, every shred of evidence that this wasn't a bear attack. By afternoon, the FBI had arrived, agents in dark suits who took one look at the bodies and called for the CDC, the Department of Wildlife, and something else. A phone number that wasn't in any official directory, that led to a voice that didn't identify itself. Sarah slipped away during the chaos, finding Carter in the parking lot of the county hospital. He looked worse than she felt, his eyes hollow, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't light his cigarette. "Ruiz is dead," he said before Sarah could speak. The words hit her like a physical blow. "What?" "They found her this morning in her lab. She'd been torn apart, not just killed, dismembered. Her assistant found her at 6 a.m. The lab was destroyed. All the samples, all the evidence we collected gone, but they found this." He held out his phone, showing her a photograph. It was the wall of Ruiz's laboratory, the white tiles now covered in red. Written in what the caption confirmed was Ruiz's own blood were the words, "You broke the pact." "She was still alive when she wrote it," Carter said, his voice breaking. "They could tell from the blood spatter. She was missing both legs, both arms, and she was still alive. She used her own stumps to write that message, because it made her, because it wanted us to know." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. She leaned against Carter's truck, her breath coming in short gasps, the tooth in her pocket burning against her leg like a coal. "We need to end this," she said. "We need to find a way to stop it." "Holloway said there was no way," Carter reminded her. "He said the pact doesn't end." "Then we change the terms," Sarah said. "We find where it sleeps. We find where it goes when it's not hunting, and we destroy it." She pulled out her own research, the notes she had made at the burial ground, the maps she had drawn of the grave locations. They formed a pattern, she realized now. A spiral curling inward toward a central point where the river bent back on itself, where the water ran black even in daylight. "The Mistinka River," she said. "That's where it sleeps. That's where it goes to rest. Water, it hates water. Remember Holloway's story? The thing from the dashcam dragging the deer carcass, it stayed away from the river. It moved parallel to it but never touched it." "The Elder's Journal," Carter said, his eyes widening. "Ezekiel's journal, it mentioned something about that. The black water holds them. The black water drowns them. The black water is the only place they fear." They drove to the library, to the historical society, searching for anything about the river, about water, about drowning. They found it in a newspaper clipping from 1923, yellowed and fragile, that told of a farmer named Josiah Wendel who had confessed to feeding drifters and wanderers, to the black ones, before hanging himself from his barn rafters. The article mentioned that Wendel had tried to end the pact. He had lured the creatures, Sarah noted the plural, her blood running cold, to the river, hoping to drown them. But he had failed, and the price of his failure had been his sanity, and then his life. But there was another note, a marginalia in faded pencil, added later by someone who had studied the article. "He used the wrong bait. He used strangers. The pact demands family. The pact demands blood." Sarah looked at Carter, and he looked at her, and in that moment they both understood what they had to do. "I'm a Carter," he said, "descended from Ezekiel, the bloodline that made the original deal." "And I'm a Delacroix," Sarah said, "related to Frank, to the other victims. We both carry the blood, we both have the connection." "If we lure it," Carter said slowly, "if we use ourselves as bait, we might be able to draw it to the river. We might be able to make it cross into the water." "And then what?" Sarah asked. "Even if it touches the water, even if the water hurts it, what then? We can't kill it. Holloway said bullets don't work, fire only slows it down. What can we do?" "We drown it," Carter said. "Not just touch it to water, drown it. Hold it under until it stops moving, until it stops changing." "That's suicide," Sarah said. "Probably," Carter agreed. "But what choice do we have? If we run, it follows. If we hide, it finds us. It knows our names, Sarah. It knows our blood. The only way to end this is to face it." They spent the next 2 days preparing. They bought diving weights, chains, locks. They rigged a deer carcass with thermal sensors and GPS trackers, hoping to use it as a distraction. They found an abandoned boathouse on the river, crumbling but structurally sound, where they could wait and watch. Sarah called her mother, her sister, her friends. She didn't tell them what was happening, but she told them she loved them. Carter burned his research, sending copies to every news outlet he could find, hoping that even if they failed, someone would know the truth. On the third night, they drove to the river. The Mistinka was everything the legends described. Black water that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, moving slowly through the forest like oil, silent and heavy. The smell was wrong, not the fresh scent of river water, but something stagnant, something that had been still for too long. They set up in the boathouse, the deer carcass staked out 50 yards upstream, the chains and weights ready by their feet. They had knives, axes, flares, everything they could think of that might slow the thing down, hold it back, give them time. They didn't have to wait long. It came out of the trees at midnight, exactly as the old story said. Sarah saw it through the night vision scope they had brought, and her breath stopped in her throat. It was bigger than the dashcam footage suggested. Taller than a man, bent at the waist so its arms hung almost to the ground, the limbs too long, the joints bending in directions that made her eyes water to watch. The fur, coarse and black, covered most of its body, but patches showed through where the transformation was incomplete, where the human skin was still visible beneath the pelt. The face was the worst. It was almost human, the features recognizable but stretched, elongated, the jaw protruding to accommodate the fangs that gleamed in the moonlight. The eyes were yellow, glowing with their own inner light, and they scanned the clearing with an intelligence that was unmistakable. It moved toward the deer carcass, sniffing the air, its head cocked at that predatory angle. It was cautious, wary, sensing the trap, but the hunger was stronger. The pact had been broken, the offerings had stopped, and it was starving. "Now," Carter whispered. Sarah lit the flares, throwing them into the clearing. The bright red light illuminated the creature fully, and it screamed, a sound that was part human, part animal, part something else entirely. It turned toward the boathouse, and Sarah saw its face clearly for the first time. She recognized it. Not fully, not completely, but enough. The bone structure, the shape of the eyes, the scar above the left eyebrow. This thing had been human once, had been someone, and she knew with a certainty that transcended logic that this was Derek Haverson. This was what he had become, what the transformation had made him, what the pact had recruited. "Derek," she whispered, and the thing stopped. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in those yellow eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. The Derek that had been trapped inside the monster that he had become. Then the moment passed, and the thing growled, low and menacing, and charged. They ran. They burst from the boathouse and ran toward the river, the thing behind them moving with terrible speed despite its awkward gait. Sarah could hear it, could hear its claws on the earth, its breath in her ear, close enough to touch. Carter reached the water first, plunging in without hesitation, the chains wrapped around his waist. He turned, facing the creature, and screamed, "I am Carter. I am blood of Ezekiel. I end the pact." The thing stopped at the water's edge, hesitating. It growled, whined, paced back and forth, its eyes fixed on Carter but its body refusing to enter the river. "Come on," Carter screamed. "Take me, take the blood, but come into the water, come into the black water." It lunged, not at Carter but at Sarah, who had been slower, who was still 3 feet from the river's edge. She felt its claws on her back, felt the breath hot on her neck, and then she was falling, tumbling into the river with the thing on top of her. The water closed over them both, and the world became a chaos of thrashing limbs and bubbles and screams that turned to gurgles. Sarah felt the thing's grip on her loosen, felt it convulsing, its body contorting in agony as the water, the blessed, terrible water, surrounded it. Carter was there, his hands on the chains, wrapping them around the creature's thrashing form. He was shouting something, words that Sarah couldn't hear through the water in her ears, but she understood. She understood what they had to do. They dragged it deeper. The riverbed dropped off suddenly, a sinkhole that plunged 20 feet into blackness. Sarah felt the weights pulling them down, felt the creature's struggles growing weaker as the pressure increased. It was changing. Even now, even dying, it was trying to transform. The fur was falling away in clumps, revealing the human skin beneath, the face shifting, the jaw shortening, the teeth receding. For a moment, Sarah looked into Derek Haverson's eyes, real eyes, human eyes, and she saw him there, the boy he had been, scared and confused and sorry. Then the bubbles stopped. The thrashing stopped. The man went limp and the transformation reversed, the body shrinking, folding in on itself, until what floated in the water was just a corpse, just a dead boy with no fangs and no fur and no yellow eyes. They dragged themselves to shore, coughing and vomiting river water, their bodies battered and bruised. Carter's arm was broken, Sarah's ribs cracked, but they were alive. They had survived. They sat on the bank, watching the water where the body had sunk, waiting for it to surface. But it didn't. Whatever had been in Derek Haverson, whatever had transformed him, whatever had kept him alive after death, it stayed in the water. The black water held it. The black water drowned it. "Is it over?" Carter asked, his voice hoarse. Sarah didn't answer. She was staring at the river, watching the surface. At first, she thought she was seeing things, hallucinating from oxygen deprivation and trauma. But then Carter saw it too. Bones, dozens of bones surfacing from the depths, floating to the top like a graveyard rising from the depths. Human bones, animal bones, bones that were neither, all of them showing the same transformations. The elongated canines, the fused joints, the signs of bodies that had tried to become something else. And there were more than bones. There were bodies. Fresh bodies, still clothed, still recognizable. Missing persons from years past, decades past, all of them surfacing now as if the river was giving up its dead. "The pact," Sarah whispered. "It's not just one creature, it's never been just one, it's all of them, everyone who was ever transformed, everyone who ever paid the price." Carter stared at the floating graveyard, his face pale in the moonlight. The river holds them. The river drowns them. That's why it feared the water. That's why the pact demanded offerings on land, because water is the only thing that can truly kill them. They called the authorities from a gas station 5 miles away, anonymous tips about bodies in the Mistinka River. They didn't stay to see the response. They drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the Wendel Road Pact. But the pact wasn't finished with them. 2 weeks later, Sarah received a package in the mail. No return address, no stamp, just her name written in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a single photograph, printed on glossy paper, showing the burial ground where she had first dug up the bones. The graves were open, the bodies gone. Standing in the center of the clearing, looking directly at the camera with yellow eyes that glowed even in the photograph, was something that wore her face. On the back of the photograph, in the same unfamiliar handwriting, were 3 words: "The Pact, RENEWS." She burned the photograph. She tried to forget what she had seen, but in her dreams she walked on all 4s and she hunted, and she whispered in languages she didn't know. And sometimes, when she looked in the mirror, she saw her canines growing longer, sharpening, preparing for the day when she would join the others in the woods. Carter published his story. He wrote it all: the journal, the pact, the creatures, the river. He submitted it to every publisher, every newspaper, every online outlet that would take it. And then his apartment burned down. The manuscript, his notes, his computer, all destroyed. The fire department ruled it electrical, a faulty wire in the old building. But Carter found a single page that had blown clear of the flames, landing in the street where a neighbor had picked it up. It was the last page of his manuscript, the conclusion where he had tried to make sense of everything they had learned. And written across it, in handwriting that matched the photograph, were 5 words: "They are not wolves. They are what wolves fear." Carter disappeared after that. His car was found abandoned near the Mistinka River, the driver's side door open, the engine still running. His body was never found. But on the anniversary of his disappearance, a new grave appeared in the burial ground, shallow and fresh, and the bones within it had elongated canines. Sarah continued her work. She went back to Chicago, to the university, to the familiar rhythms of academic life. She published papers on animal attacks, on trauma analysis, on the ways that fear and adrenaline could warp the human body. She never mentioned the pact, the river, the creatures. She told herself it was over, that they had won, that the drowning had ended it. But she kept the tooth. She wore it around her neck on a leather cord, and she never took it off, not even to shower or sleep. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind blew through the trees outside her window, she heard howling. Not the howling of coyotes or wolves, but something else. Something that walked on two legs and remembered her name. Dr. Elena Ruiz was declared a victim of a violent crime, her killer never found. The FBI closed the case, citing lack of evidence. The massacre at the family reunion was officially a bear attack, despite the testimony of the survivors who swore they had seen a man walking on all fours, whispering in a language they didn't understand. Sarah visited them once in the hospital before they were transferred to a psychiatric facility. The girl, 17 years old, grabbed Sarah's arm with a strength that belied her condition. "It said your name," the girl whispered, her eyes wide and terrified. "Before it killed my mother, it said your name. It said Sarah Chen broke the pact and now you all must pay. It said you belong to them now." Sarah pulled away, her heart hammering in her chest. She ran from the hospital, from the city, from everything she had built. She moved to a small town in Montana, population 400, where the nearest forest was 50 miles away and the only water was a creek that dried up in summer. It didn't matter. The dreams followed her. The howling followed her. And one morning she woke to find scratches on her bedroom door, claw marks too deep to be made by any animal, arranged in patterns that almost looked like words. She understood, finally, what Holloway had meant. The pact wasn't something you could end. It was something you could only postpone. The debt would come due, in blood and transformation and endless hunger, and there was no escaping it. The last entry in her journal, found after her disappearance 6 months later, reads simply, "I looked in the mirror tonight and my eyes were yellow. I don't know when I stopped being me and started becoming them, but I can feel it now. The hunger, the need, the pact calls and I must answer." Her body was never found, but on the first anniversary of her disappearance, a new grave appeared in the burial ground near Fergus Falls. It was shallow, freshly dug, and the bones within it had elongated canines and eyes that glowed yellow in the darkness. In the end, the pact continued. It would always continue. The Wendel Road stretched through the Minnesota forests, and the creatures walked it on two legs that remembered four, waiting for the next traveler, the next lost soul, the next offering. They were patient. They were eternal. They were hungry. And somewhere in the dark water of the Mistinka River, something stirred that had been drowned a century ago, 100 years of silence ending as the debt came due once more. The water boiled. The bones surfaced. And the howling began again, rising through the pines like a prayer to old gods who had never stopped listening, never stopped waiting, never stopped hunting. The final scene, captured on a security camera in Duluth 3 years later, showed a shadow climbing a pine tree. Not ascending, but descending, moving downward with its head toward the earth, its feet gripping the bark, its back bent at an impossible angle. The video lasted 30 seconds before the camera shorted out, but not before 666 people had viewed it online. When technicians repaired the camera the next morning, they found claw marks in the metal housing, and written in sap that had oozed from the tree itself, 3 words that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The pact holds. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.